you to turn to the person next to you. I want you to look them in the eye, and I want you to introduce yourself as a genius. Let's begin. Now, can you give me your best for the next hour and a half? Can you stay present in the moment? I never really planned on doing any of this from a personal standpoint. In 1986, I was living in Southern California, and I was in a triathlon. And I had been training for about 6 months for this particular triathlon because I was with two other guys, and we had a little bet going that the winner out of the three of us of the triathlon would be taken anywhere along the West Coast, all expenses paid, by the two losers. So my life, consisted of waking up at 4:30 or 5 in the morning, swimming a mile, going and seeing patients. On my lunch, I would run down the boardwalk in Mission Beach, 10 kilometers, eat a lunch, come back, see patients, get on my bike, and I would cycle for about 25 miles every day. So, in order for us to wake up, we need a wake-up call. And the night before the race, I get a phone call from the two guys, and they say, "We can't do this race. We're not prepared. We want to do the next one." I'm thinking, what was all of that for? So I almost decided to just can the whole thing, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to go and do this race anyway. It'd be a good practice for me. So I called up my training partner, and we drove out to Palm Springs, and it was a Bud Light Desert Triathlon, and they expected about 500 people for the race, but there were over 1,000 people that came and attended this particular race. So when you have that many people on the course, you have to divide the group into two groups. You send one group, and then an hour and a half later, you send a second group, so there's not too many people on the course. So I was getting the number written on my leg. You know how in triathlons, and I had my hands up like this, and the lady was writing the number on my leg, and I said, "I'm in the first group. When do I go?" And she said, "About 20 minutes. And the moment she said that, they shot the gun off. And I look at her, and she goes, "Looks like you're starting right now." And I should have known better because they were disorganized from the start. So now I'm standing by the staging area. My bicycle's over here. I have to run my bicycle over to the other staging area. And then the people that are in the water around the lake are about a quarter of a mile away from where I am. So now I have to run in my swim trunks all the way around the lake, get in the water, and I have to try to catch up with the group. And so if you've ever been in the water with people in a triathlon and you're trying to catch up, you can plan on getting kicked in the head. You can plan, it's just organized chaos. And so I kind of veered around the group, and I did my best to catch up. And at the time, the biking portion of the race was my strongest event. So I figured I'm not going to save anything. I'm just going to give it everything I have. So I'm about 10 miles into the race, and I'm coming up to a corner like this. And there's a police officer on the corner, and he's squatting down like this, and he's pointing at me like this. And I'm looking right at him, and there's two cyclists turning the corner, and he's going like this to me. He's pointing at me, and he's telling me to make the turn. He's going like this. And so I'm just kind of looking at him, and I'm looking at the two bikers, and I'm passing these two bikers on the corner. The problem was he had his back to the oncoming traffic. So the moment I made the turn, this four-wheel drive Bronco going about 55 miles an hour catapults me out of my bicycle. I fly in the air, land on my back, and it was an 83-year-old woman on the course, and her reflexes weren't the best. So when I landed, I looked, and here comes this metal bumper towards me. And I kind of get a grip on the metal bumper, and I take a little drag down the road, and then she stops short, and I roll for 25 yards. And I'm laying on my back, and I could feel the blood pooling in my thoracic cavity, and I knew this wasn't a sprained strain, if you know what I mean. And I started to feel some pretty odd sensations in my body, and all of a sudden there were bikers whizzing by and cursing, and they didn't know whether to stop or go. And anyway, They put me in an ambulance and they took me to JFK Hospital. And I went through, oh, by the way, that day the CAT scan machine was broken. So I refused any medications, and my body was involuntarily convulsing. I couldn't control it. And so I was moving during the CAT scan. I wasn't trying to move, it was just happening. So I was in this tube for about 12 hours, imagine. And then I had x-rays done, and they did all these tests. And I went to bed that night, and when I woke up in the morning, I'll never forget it. The one side of my body was all road rash, right? So when I woke up in the morning, I had the sheets stuck to my skin. I was just stuck to the sheets, like they were connected to me. So they came with these water bottles, spray bottles. And for about an hour and 15 minutes or so, they would spray and they'd slowly peel it off and spray. Anyway, you can imagine how my morning was. And all of a sudden, in comes the orthopedic surgeon, and he takes my x-rays, and he throws up the side view of my back. It's called a lateral spine. The moment I see the x-ray, I see that I had fractured T8, T9, T10, T11, T12, and L1. And I looked up at that T8 vertebrae, and that one was really compressed, more than 60% compressed. Well, think about it. If you land on your rump really hard, and your vertebrae are blocks or columns, the compressive force does what to those columns? Flattens them out like a pancake. But when you flatten them out, bone fragments or bone has to go somewhere. So when I landed, that top one was more than 60% collapsed, and the bone fragments went back on my spinal cord. So then he put up the the CAT scan. Now we're looking down the canal, and I see my neural arch, the arch that the spinal cord passes through, is broken like a pretzel, and it's pressing up against my cord. And I know exactly what he's going to say next. And he says, you're going to need Harrington rod surgery if you ever plan on walking again. And what Harrington rods are, they're these stainless steel rods. And what they do is they cut off, like with a circular saw, they cut off the back parts of your vertebrae. And in my case, they were 12-inch stainless steel rods. And they drill them in to your spine, and when they drill them in, it will pull the spine back and take the pressure off the cord, hopefully, if it's not too seriously damaged. Well, and then they come and they cut your butt cheek open, and they scrape bone fragments off your hip, and they paste it over the top, and they stabilize the fractures. Now, if I had seen a person with this kind of multiple injury, I probably would have said, you need Harrington rod surgery. But this was me. And I wasn't so ready to say, okay. And I said, do I have any other options? He said, there's no other options. So then he left, and my roommate from college lived in Honolulu at the time. When I woke up that morning, he was sitting there. I don't know how he got there, but he took a night flight, and he was there waiting for me. And so we said, let's get an opinion from a neurosurgeon. So in comes a neurosurgeon. He throws up the lateral x-rays. We look at the CAT scans, and he says, look, you need Harrington rod surgery. There's just no other option. And I say, there's no other option. Nobody's ever refused the surgery. He said, not that I know of. I mean, maybe in Europe, 1 or 2 people have tried it, but I don't recommend it. You're facing paralysis, and, your life is going to change dramatically, and don't get your hopes up. So it's almost like a voodoo curse, When a voodoo priest says, gives you the voodoo curse, if you accept, believe, and surrender to that thought without analysis, you start to program your subconscious. So I wasn't so ready to accept, believe, and surrender without analysis. So I decided with my roommate that the best thing to do was to go back to San Diego. So they put me in an ambulance, and they drove me all the way back to San Diego. And I go to Scripps Hospital, which is the hospital in Southern California. The moment I'm wheeled into my room, here is Mr. Credibility. He is the medical director and the orthopedic surgeon of this hospital. He's got the salt and pepper hair and the mustache and a distinguished look, and he's got the lab coat with a stethoscope wrapped around. It's nice, power tie there. And he says, look, the moment I'm in there, he comes right up to me and he says, look, you have multiple compression fractures of your spine. You have spinal cord fragmentation, bone fragments. There's impingement. We need to get you on the operating table right away. And then he says the key word. If you were my son, you'd be on the table right now. I wanted to believe this guy, because he was so competent and so confident. So I say to him, well, I just give me a little time here. I just got here. I need to just decide on what I want to do. And he said, listen, you have 48 hours max to make this decision, because after 48 hours, your body is going to start calcifying those fractures. And they're not going to heal, but they're just going to start calcifying. And then we have to do a radical surgery where we have to cut you open in the front and cut you open in the back. And there's a high mortality rate with that. But so anyway, have a nice night. So now, I don't know about you, but one of the worst forms of human suffering is indecision. And when we're indecisive about things, choices we have to make, it wears on us. And so now all of my friends that I lived in San Diego were all in the hospital room. There were physicians, there were chiropractors, naturopaths, physical therapists, psychotherapists, Oriental medicine people, all the guys and ladies I hung out with. They were right around the entire bed. Now you know you're in trouble in your life when people pat you on the shoulder and they say, we know you're going to make the right decision. Because what that really translates into is, I am so glad I am not you. Now, I was young and innocent at the time and a pretty cocky guy. And I could see in their faces, every single one of them, that discomfort, that they did not want to have to make a choice that I had to make. And I saw how they patted me on the shoulder and filed out of the room, and then they were just happy to go back to their familiar lives. And my roommate from college stayed with me. And we looked at those MRIs, and we looked at those CAT scans, and we looked at those X-rays over and over again, over and over again. And we said, we should get one more opinion. So we called the fourth surgeon in. He was an orthopedic surgeon. This guy was about 6'3", and he was about 280 pounds. Big guy. He comes walking in. He says, listen, we don't have to put it at 12-inch stainless steel rods in your spine. We can put 8-inch stainless steel rods in your spine. We can leave them in for a year, and then we can take them out, and we can put 4-inch stainless steel rods in your spine. So now, as he's talking to me, he's fading away, and I'm thinking about living my life on addictive medications and being handicapped the rest of my life. And I kind of come back to my senses, and I say to him, hey, Doc, don't you think by putting those Harrington rods in my spine that would limit motion in my thoracic spine? And he said, oh, you don't have any motion in your thoracic spine. And the moment he said that, something clicked. Now, I had a yoga studio in San Diego, a very successful yoga studio, and I taught martial arts at the same time in that yoga studio. And I looked at him and I thought, maybe you don't have any motion in your thoracic spine. But I got a hell of a lot more motion than you. And the moment I thought that, something clicked in me. And I looked him right in the eye and I said, I want to leave. And he said, what? I said, I know what I'm doing. I just want to go home. Now, orthopedic surgeon number 3, Marcus Welby, he shows up. And of course, what do you think he's telling me? I have post-traumatic stress disorder, that I must have hit my head when I landed because this was so outside the box. So I believed in this one concept at the time, and the concept was the power that made the body heals the body. And it doesn't happen any other way. And so when I left that hospital, I went to some very dear friends of mine's home, and I convalesced there, and I made 2 very important decisions. The first decision was that I was going to connect with this power, this intelligence. I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't doing anything. I was laying face down like this. And so I said, I have all this time to begin to interact with it, to develop a relationship with it, to begin to evoke it. And then I'm going to give it a very specific plan. a specific template, a design. Now, I believed at the time, and I still do, that intelligence is a consciousness. And consciousness is awareness, and awareness is paying attention. So it must be paying attention to me. And so I said, look, I'm going to create a very clear design of what I want, and then I'm going to surrender this design to this greater mind. I'm going to get out of the way. It knows how to do it way better than me, and I'm going to allow it to organize it in a way that's perfect for me. Get the idea? Now, the second thing I decided was I'm not going to let any thought slip by my awareness that I don't want to experience. Now, that sounds really easy, right? But you ever notice that when you're in crisis, you tend to focus on what you don't want instead of what you do want? And it's because the hormones and emotions of stress cause you to think equal to how you feel. And I realized in that moment that in order to change, that we have to think greater than how we feel. And so I began this inward journey. And every day I would start reconstructing my spine, and I realized that this awareness was paying attention to me, that it was present, that I would have to be present with it. You know how you're present with your spouse or your lover or your kids or your boss or your coworker, and you know when you're present and when you're not, and they know when you're present and when you're not. Would you agree? So then I said, it's observing me, it's what it's doing, so I have to give it a very clear design. And if I lose my attention at any point, I'm not sending a very clear message. I got to stop and start all over again. It was just that tedious. You get the idea? So I would go within and I'd start reconstructing my vertebrae with a plaster trowel, and I would start redesigning. And I could draw those vertebrae upside down and backwards with my left hand. I know them so intimately. And so I would start reconstructing the vertebrae, and the next thing you know, I'd be thinking about being in a wheelchair. Oh, I got to start all over again. Then I start all over again, and then I think, should I sell my practice? Should I sell my house? My friends were telling me, sell your practice, sell your practice. And I kept saying no. And you know why? Because if I sold my practice, then I would believe that I wouldn't be able to walk again. And I wouldn't do it. And they were pushing me. And I kept saying, no, I'm not going to sell it. Because I didn't want to surrender to that potential. So I would start reconstructing my vertebrae. I wanted to be present with this intelligence. My mind was bouncing all over the place. And I'd get frustrated. And I'd get impatient. And then the more frustrated I got, what happened? The more frustrated I became, which caused me to feel more frustration and think more frustrated thoughts. And I would get all out of balance and get angry. And I'd stop and I'd start all over again. And it would take me hours, when I tell you hours, to go through this entire process. Well, right around the 6th week, I gone through this internal process, and it took me about, a little under 2 hours. It normally took me 3 hours. And when I went through the whole thing, I went from start to finish in specific detail. And I didn't know at the time, but for 6 weeks, I was training my mind. I was becoming more focused and more centered, and I was increasing my attention span. And I was beginning to wire and fire and wire and fire all this information in my brain. And if I revisited it every day, I began to make it easier because nerve cells that fire together. So you are geniuses. So then I was beginning to reconstruct my spine, and it was being mapped in my brain. And as long as I revisited it, it got easier and easier. So when I finished that whole internal process, something clicked. It was like hitting a golf ball just right, or hitting a tennis ball right in the sweet spot, or cooking a really great meal. Something clicked. And I paid attention to that feeling. It felt right somehow. I felt whole in that moment. And from that point on, I started to notice some very significant changes in my body. I started getting feeling where I didn't have it again. I started able to move certain toes, and I was feeling so much less pain because I was in incredible pain every day. And it was like everything was, the volume was going down on pain, and my motor skills and my sensory skills, the volume was going up. And the moment I was able to correlate what I was doing inside of me that was producing some result outside of me, I paid attention to what I did, and I did it with more enthusiasm. I did it with more passion. It was no longer torture. It was something that I was excited to do. It became instrumental. And so it got easier and easier and easier. And so it took me 3 hours to do, I was able to do in 45 minutes. And so now I had all this extra time in my hands. So I had a lot of time on my hands anyway. So I started thinking about all the things in my life that I had taken for granted. You know, like walking, like seeing a sunset. I lived right on the beach in La Jolla. I didn't even go see the sunset. I was too busy. I wanted to sit up with my friends and eat lunch and really enjoy my lunch. I wanted to take a shower in a shower. I wanted to use the toilet. I just wanted to be able to live. And I didn't know what I was doing at the time, but I began to select different potentials that were existing in the quantum field. And how many potentials exist in the quantum field? A few. So I was selecting those potentials in the quantum field, and I was emotionally embracing that future reality in the present moment. And my body, as the unconscious mind, began to believe it was living in the future in the present moment. And I was literally signaling new genes in new ways, and my body was responding to my mind. And so I started to notice more and more changes, and I kept at it. And there were other things that I did, but that's another story. And right around the 10th week, I don't know how to describe this, but I just had a knowingness. You know when you know that you know? It was 10 weeks and a few days, and I had been crawling around on all fours. And I woke up that morning, and I knew it was the day that I was going to walk. I don't know how to describe it. I just got up. It was 6 in the morning. I walked into my buddy's bedroom. He was sleeping with his wife, and I tapped him on the head. And he was, "What are you doing? What?" He jumped out of bed. He was like back against the closet. I said, "I'm going home today." Now, they came, orthopedic surgeon number 3, remember that guy? He said that I had to wear a body cast from my hips to my chin, and that I'd have to wear it for 6 months after the 6 months of convalescence. And so I took this body brace and I put it on after I had been walking around. And I wore it for about 10 minutes, and I said, "There's no way I'm going to wear this thing." And at 10 and a half weeks, I walked back into my life, and then I was back seeing patients at 12 weeks, and I was training again at 12 weeks also. Now, I made a deal with myself in those dark nights, in those sleepless nights, where I was weighing my old beliefs against new paradigms. You know, the dark night of the soul, when you realize that nobody has the answers but you. And you begin to look within. And I struggled a lot. And I made a deal with myself, and the deal was with this greater intelligence. And I said to it, if I'm ever able to walk again, I'll spend the rest of my life studying this phenomenon. Now, when you are initiated in your life by crisis or trauma or diagnosis or disease or loss, those initiations are for you to scramble a new level of mind. And when I walked back into my life, I couldn't relate with my friends anymore. You know, what was I going to complain about? I had no reason to complain. I'd go golfing when they were I couldn't complain. I didn't say anything. All I wanted to do was be happy. And I couldn't relate to my relationships anymore. I decided to leave Southern California, and I moved up to the Pacific Northwest and live out in the country. And I wanted to retreat from the world for a period of time because I was asking some really important questions. You know, questions like, who am I? What am I doing here? Why am I doing all this stuff, and for who? And what is the meaning of life? You know, those fundamentally important questions that begin to stir that soul in us that wants greater understandings. And so, for the first time in my life, I became a real spiritual person. Well, at least I thought I did. And I wanted to know. And I wasn't going to settle for metaphysical, dogmatic information, that I was a scientifically minded person, and I wanted to use science as the contemporary language of mysticism. And I wanted to see the understanding and demystify all these concepts in a practical way. So I started reading about quantum physics. I started reading about mind. I started reading about neuroscience. And I was fascinated with all the ideas. I started taking continuing education classes. And then a couple, maybe 5 years, I start getting this itch. And the itch is, if you had this type of remission from a condition, has anybody else had this experience? So I began to study spontaneous remissions. And I traveled to 17 different countries, and I started interviewing people that were diagnosed with really serious health conditions: diabetes, cancer, high blood pressure, chronic pain, celiac disease, MS. And they were treating, conventionally or unconventionally, and they were staying the same or getting worse. Then all of a sudden they got better. Now, when something happens like that in science, that's called an incident. Oh, there was an incident. Someone was healed of cancer, and there's no meaning. Now, if you see two experiences or incidents happening at the same time that are related, that's called a coincidence. Like, oh, there's two people that have had this experience. Now, when you start seeing it happen 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 times, now you're looking at a trend. In other words, there has to be some cause that's producing that effect. So then I wanted to study what that cause was that produced effects. So I was so moved by these people. They weren't scientists. They weren't rabbis or priests or monks. They were common people like you and I. And so I interviewed all these people and asked them all these questions about what they did, and I wanted to understand what they were doing inside of them that were producing that result outside of them, and seeing if it was anything that I did. And because I had the experience, I wanted to see if there were any relationships. Well, I was so fascinated by these people and so moved by them that I had to go back to school and study neuroscience to be able to understand what was happening in the brain and the body. And so I wrote my first book called Evolve Your Brain, and that book is a densely scientific book about what these people did, the 4 principles that they had embraced in order to change their internal states. And so they believed in a divine intelligence within them, not outside of them, and they wanted to make contact with that intelligence, and that intelligence is nothing to do with anything mystical. It's keeping your heart beating 2 gallons of blood per minute, 100 gallons of blood in 1 hour, 100,000 times in 1 day through 60,000 miles of blood vessels. And your vascular system is 3% of your body weight. That you lose 10 million cells every second. Oops, you just made another 10 million. That in 1 cell of your body, it goes through the order of 100,000 chemical reactions per second. So this mind is a mind that's much bigger than our mind. Would you agree? That it has a will so much greater than our will. And it has a love for life. It's loving us into life. And these people said, when my will matches its will, when my mind matches its mind, and when my love for life matches its love for life, it should answer the call. And so they began to develop a relationship with this intelligence, just like I did. And they weren't looking outside of themselves. They were actually looking where? Inside of themselves, that this intelligence is both personal and universal. That same intelligence that's taking 2 million liters of blood in 1 day, 2 million liters of air in 1 day and circulating to all your cells in seconds. That intelligence is the same intelligence that's creating supernovas in distant galaxies, forcing a lily into bloom. It's within you and all around you. And so they began to do the same thing, give it a message, and then surrender that information that to a greater mind and allow it to organize it perfectly for them. The second thing they had in common was that they realized that it was their own mismanagement of their emotional body and their emotional state that created their disease. It was their 20 years of hatred, their 30 years of anxiety and fear, their 50 years of guilt, and it was that emotion that was bringing them to a lower denominator. And it was those emotions that were driving certain thoughts, and those thoughts were reinforcing certain emotions, and they were moving from thinking to feeling and feeling and thinking, and that cycle created a state of being. And the redundancy of that cycle conditions the body to become the mind. And 95% of who we are by the time we're 35 years old is a set of memorized behaviors and emotional reactions, beliefs and perceptions that function subconsciously like a computer program where the body knows to do it better than the brain. So then they had to break the habit of being themselves. And they understood that the hormones of stress, by the way, they're the ones that push the genetic buttons that create disease. And if those emotions are driving certain thoughts, then they're making themselves sick by thought alone. So if their thoughts can make you sick, is it possible that your thoughts can make you? Well, they examined that, and they realized that they had maybe signaling the wrong genes in the wrong way, and at one time they were healthy, and maybe they could signal new genes in new ways and feel better. How many people understand? So they began the great work, and they began to unmemorize emotions that were stored in their body, and then when they began to break free from the addictions of those emotional states, they started to feel joy, because the absence of an addiction is called joy. And so they were freeing energy from their body into the field, and they were beginning to look at life from a new landscape. They could see possibilities that they could never see before because they were no longer viewing their life through the lens of the past, because emotions are a record of the past. And so then when you react to something or someone in your life and you have an emotional response, if you don't know how to control your emotional response, it's going to turn into a mood. One long emotional reaction. Someone will say to you, "What's wrong with you?" "Oh, God, I'm so glad you asked. I'm in a mood today. Do you mind if I throw up on you a little bit?" And then they tell you about all the reasons why they're in a mood. This person did that, and they're just reaffirming that emotional state. And they tell the story equal to the emotion. And they might even embellish it a little bit. And in Scientific American, I was telling the group yesterday, right 2 months ago, front page article, 50% of your past that you talk about is not even true. So anyway, that was Scientific American. So then they can't control it and they let it linger. That one long emotional reaction from some event turns into a temperament. Why are you so angry or so impatient? Well, this event happened to me 9 months ago, and I'm living by the same emotional reaction. I'm memorizing my emotion. And every time you think about that event, you produce the same chemistry in your brain and body. And your body, as the unconscious mind, is living in the past 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if you condition the body to be the mind of that emotion, now your body literally is in the past. And so you can't create a new future holding on to the emotions of the past. And so if you allow that refractory period to last for years on end, that's called a personality trait. And people wear their emotions layer by layer. And they wear them on their sleeve as if that's who they really are. That's not who we are. That's residue from the past. And only when we overcome our emotional state do we have wisdom. Because a memory without the emotional charge is called wisdom, and that's the name of the game here. And so they broke free from their past. And they no longer dysregulated or downregulated the same genes in the same way, and they broke their addictions to those emotions, and it was no longer about their ex-husband or their father that was an alcoholic. They realized that they still had to change. Third thing they had in common is they had to reinvent themselves. They had to become somebody else. And they began to think about who they wanted to be in their new life. They began to plan their behaviors. They began to speculate choices they were going to make, and they began to emotionally embrace how it would feel to be healthy again or to be happy again. And when they felt those elevated emotions, they were giving their body a taste of the future in the present moment. And now those elevated emotions were driving them to a new destiny instead of the survival emotions keeping them anchored to the past. And they fired and wired new circuits in their brain, and it became the platform of their identity, and they emotionally conditioned their body to a new mind. And they wouldn't get up from their meditation until they were that person. And so The next thing they had in common is that they had long moments where they had lost track of time and space. They were so within. They were internalizing this rehearsal of who they wanted to be, that when they opened their eyes, they expected it to be 20 minutes later, and it was an hour and 20 minutes later. And they had lost track of time and space, and they were interacting in the quantum. And we have all the biological and neurological machinery to do this. And when we're truly focused and we're truly paying attention, the frontal lobe turns on, the crowning achievement of the human being. And when that forebrain turns on, it silences the circuits in the rest of the brain so that you're not thinking about anything else but that single-minded thought. And it's that kind of attention that allows you to become nobody, to become no one, to become no thing, to become nowhere in no time. You can't walk through the door to the quantum field as a somebody. You have to walk through that door as a nobody. And they were dissociating from their known life. And the longer they lingered in that place, nerve cells that no longer fire together, no longer wire together. And if they're not emotionally feeling the same feelings, they're no longer signaling the same genes in the same way. And they began to change from the inside out. How many people understand? And so I published my first book, and right around that time, just before it was published, I got approached by the people that wrote the movie What the Bleep. And they approached me, and the director and the producer had seen me speak in Barcelona, and he sent me the script to look at of What the Bleep. And I didn't think he was serious, so I got this was the days when it came in a big envelope. And, the big script there, and you'd rip open the envelope, and then you'd read this, hard copy, and I went through the entire manuscript, and with a red marker, bad science, you can't say that. I thought, this will keep him busy for a while, because I didn't think he was serious. And 10 days later, I get another thing in the mail. So he's edited the whole thing, and I read it, and I redline it again, and we do this volley like 3 or 4 times. And then the next thing you know, he's interviewing people for this movie. And I'll never forget the day that I did my interview, because I was pouring concrete in the morning at my ranch, and then in the afternoon, I was testifying for a patient in Supreme Court, and I was late. And by the time I got back, to my home, the camera crew was there, and so I was doing the interview, but it was the camera crew that was asking the better questions than the interviewer, because they were really, really just kind of authentic. And so I sat there and I did this interview for What the Bleep, and then I didn't think anything of it. I didn't think it would turn into anything. And the next thing I know, it's an overnight sensation. And everywhere I go now, in the United States, people need media presentations to really accept the uncommon. So I was lecturing about similar stuff before What the Bleep, and in the United States, people were like, I think I'm just going to do a colonic, don't worry about it. And I would be like, oh, all right, And so then after What the Bleep came out, everybody was like, oh, you know what? That's movie's about me. I mean, I live that way. I mean, that's who I am, So everybody started giving themselves permission to really experience the concepts in that movie, and that was the intention of the movie. We did that movie to teach 2 primary ideals. First one, question reality. It's not what you think it is. Second thing, try it out. See if you can create something by thought alone. And so started teaching with the group, and we would travel to 2 cities in one weekend, and I'd be in Austin, and then I'd be in Colorado, then I'd be in Miami, and then I'd be in LA, and it was a lot of traveling, but there was something fundamental about the same questions that were being asked after What the Bleep. And there were 2 questions that everybody asked. First question, how do you do it? How do you create the life you want? Second question, why is it so damn hard to change? And so I took those questions to heart, and we started teaching workshops around the country. And I was teaching these workshops because people were asking me, what do you do? So I would tell them what I did, and we would do these one-day workshops, and for 2 years I taught these workshops, and guess what happened? Nothing. I didn't see any real results in people's lives. I don't know if I wasn't saying it well, or I don't know if there wasn't a listening, but I didn't see many changes for people. But at the same time, I started writing my second book, Breaking the Habit, which is really the companion book, the how-to book that goes along with Evolve, because I thought, well, if I can demystify the how-to process, more people will apply it. Because I believe that this is a time in history where it's not enough to know. It's a time in history to know how. And so after a period of time of 2 years, I kept teaching these courses, these introductory courses, and then when I finished my introductory level 1 course, someone would raise their hand and say, can you teach a level 2 course? I thought, sure, I'll teach a level 2 course. My theory was, if you keep inviting me, I'll come. When they stop inviting me, I know it's over, right? So then they said, can you do a level 2? So we'd come back and do a level 2. And after the level 2, someone said, can you do a level 3? And I thought, all right, I'll do a level 3. Then I did a level 3. And then someone after the level 3 said, can you do a level 4? And I said, I don't think I know anything else. And so I had to go back and study more. And so we did another advanced course, and it was called 3.5 Pi. And so when we taught this 3.5 course, I didn't want to teach a level 4. It was just an extension of the level 3. We started seeing people in our workshops right around this time sending emails in, and the first line of every email was always the same. You're not going to believe this. I hated my father for 25 years. I've had acid reflux for 15. All of a sudden I surrendered my anger, and all of a sudden my acid reflux went away. Go figure. Or, hey, I won the lottery, and we started seeing, people doing, I got the job of my dreams, I got $40,000 more, I got my own expense account, this is the thing I've been trying to create forever, we started seeing this feedback. And when I started seeing the feedback, I knew that I was making a difference, and now I wanted to keep doing it. If I wasn't seeing the feedback, I'd give it up. So then, something amazing happened, because when we did that 3.5 event, a lady with MS that was in a wheelchair got up after one meditation and just waltzed across the room, right in front of me, who had been paralyzed for 10 years in her leg, walking completely normal. And believe me, I was more shocked than anybody. And then we did another 3.5 Pi in Seattle, and another lady that was sitting in the front row, second seat, got up, had MS too, and all of a sudden she was moving her feet around, and she was dancing around the front row around me, and I was in shock. But I realized that we were signaling new genes in new ways right in that event. And when I started teaching the concepts, I thought, well, I'm going to do the same principles that we've done, that I studied with people with spontaneous remissions. If it worked on sick people, it should work on well people too. And if people are sick, they should get well, and we should be able to reproduce it. And because anything that's reproducible, now it becomes science. So I was interested in really creating a fundamental principle of how to do this. And so I realized that the process of change requires unlearning and relearning. It requires breaking the habit of the old self and reinventing a new self. It requires pruning synaptic connections and sprouting new connections. It requires unmemorizing emotions that are stored in the body and then reconditioning the body to a new mind and to a new emotion. It requires unfiring and unwiring and refiring and rewiring. No longer signaling the same genes in the same way and signaling new genes in new ways. Requires deprogramming and reprogramming, losing your mind and creating a new one, dragging your energy out of the past and losing that energy into a new future. And so I started to work with people, and we started developing more different types of meditations, and we started seeing people do amazing things. We did an event in Colorado, and we were at this beautiful, beautiful hotel in Estes Park, and we had finished the Saturday, and I was walking back to my room, and here comes 2 security guards with the manager of the hotel, and they said, can we talk to you for a second? I'm like, sure. They go, we just want to know, are you giving out ecstasy? Because people were so incredibly high and so incredibly happy, and they kept saying, we could feel the energy in the room. We could feel the energy in the room, and I could feel it. And so we did another event called 3.5 Pi a la mode. And we had 7 people have a spontaneous remission from diseases. People with chronic bladder infections. One woman was living on lettuce for 7 years, and now she was pounding hamburgers and eating pizzas and everything else. We had people with celiac disease that were completely healed, and just all kinds of crazy things going on. And I knew now at this point that something amazing was happening. And so right around this point, I knew that it was happening in real time, that the students that we were working with were developing skills that were reproducible. So then I created this new course, an advanced course, and the course is called Information to Transformation. Now, this is where my passion lies right now, because I believe that if you give people information, relevant scientific information, and you demystify it so they can understand it, and then they can repeat that information, you have to be able to repeat it to know that it's wired in there. Would you agree? And then you give them some instruction, and they apply that information, that philosophical information, they initiate it. They should, if they do it correctly and they get their behaviors to match their intentions, they should have what? A transformation, a change. And if we could measure that transformation in real time, or before and after, we could gather more information to teach transformation better the next time. And if I could measure that transformation, I would gather more information to teach transformation. We would begin to close the gap between knowledge and experience. And so, last February, in Carefree, right here, we made scientific history. We brought a team of neuroscientists and technicians in. We had a physicist from Russia come with his instruments to measure the energy in the room. We had to measure the energy around people's bodies. We had to measure the energy centers of their bodies because our advanced group blesses those centers with information. And I wanted to see if there was feedback or change going on. In 40 minutes, I wanted to know that there was some type of autonomic change. We began to measure heart coherence. Why? Because when your heart is coherent, your brain is coherent. When your brain is coherent, your heart is coherent. And when your brain is coherent, you're coherent. When your heart is coherent, you're coherent. And when your brain is incoherent, you're incoherent. So we had people wear these heart rate monitors for 24 hours, and we were measuring their heart, orderliness, rhythm in their heart. And this concept called heart rate variability, we partnered with Heart Math Institute, and Roland McCready is a dear friend of mine, and we set up the laboratory conditions. And we scanned over 400 people's brains in the 2 workshops we did last year. We did people before the event, and then they went through 4 days of the advanced workshop, and then we scanned their brain at the end of the event. We also randomly selected people out of the audience during a meditation. We just hooked their brain up to the quantitative electroencephalographic reading, and in real time, we could measure and watch what was going on their brain while they were in a meditation. And I learned so much by observing people trying to change. I now know without a doubt, you cannot change the brain with the brain. It's impossible. I can tell you that if you try to change your ego with your ego, you'll only reinforce your ego. If you use a program to try to change the program, you'll only endorse the program. If you use matter to try to change matter, you become more matter. And I watched this woman in about a 2-hour meditation. I watched her brain get worse and worse and worse and go into higher levels of incoherence. And I kept looking at her, and I grabbed her after that meditation, and I talked to her, and I realized in that moment what to teach, because only when you are pure consciousness, only when you are an awareness, a thought in possibility, an awareness in the infinite field of potentials, if you're going to change something by thought alone, you have to become thought alone. And so all of a sudden, I had this big download, and we started taking people to deeper levels. And we started noticing their brains getting very healthy. As a matter of fact, our research shows that 93% of the people that were involved in our advanced workshops had a more than 80% change in their brain for the better. That's a pretty good statistic, right? We're measuring orderliness and coherence. We're measuring sustainability, how long they can maintain a state. We were measuring the time in which they could move from the attention on the outer world to their attention on their inner world. Now, the national average in the United States to change your brain waves is roughly about 1.5 to 2 minutes. Some of our students were doing it in 4 seconds, in 5 seconds, in 9 seconds, in 12 seconds. And that's not like, hey, I'm getting to God first. It's not like that. It's a skill. They practiced it enough times that they were able to regulate their internal states. And so we measured all these people, and we started seeing patterns in their brain that were 10 times normal rates. We saw people whose entire brains were excited with energy. We made scientific history. And the neuroscientists that we work with kept saying, this is not an artifact. This is not, I don't know what's going on. And I kept saying, the moment you know what's going on, it's over. It's got to be the unknown here. And so we started calculating and measuring all the changes, and we started to see that people were able to do the uncommon. And I now know that you are at your best when you get out of your way. When you get beyond yourself, you will do the uncommon every time. And we had people heal themselves in that event. We had people create amazing experiences. We've had people win the lottery. We had all kinds of crazy things go on, and we were capturing energy. And we saw the energy in the room start at one level, and then 3 days later, it was almost twice the level. We saw the energy field around people's bodies become more enhanced. That's who you really are, by the way. You're not this. You're this. And if you keep putting your awareness on the space around your body in space, wherever you place your attention is where you place your energy, you're going to begin to enhance the true self. And you're going to begin to amplify that field. And we now know that when you move your energy into your heart, that it not only gets coherent, but that field expands up to 9 meters wide. That's a pretty nice field, wouldn't you agree? So you go from being matter to energy. You go from particle to wave. And so I wanted to measure all these things, and we have some great slides I'm about to show you to show some of the work that we did. Next week, we have 300 plus people coming to our next advanced workshop. We did one in Colorado in July, and our advanced workshop up here in Carefree, we're doing it again. And I'm bringing in the same team. We're measuring the same things, except now I'm going to measure epigenetic changes in people's bodies. We are going to measure cortisol levels and DHEA levels. We're going to measure oxytocin, keeps you in the love zone. We're going to measure dopamine and serotonin, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and GABA, and we're going to correlate structural and functional changes in the brain, plasticity, with changes in chemistry. And we're keep creating a bigger model, and I now also know, because of mirror neurons, you know what mirror neurons are, right? Empathy neurons. They imitate. That when you see someone dance the salsa, you'll dance the salsa better. When you see someone hit a tennis ball really well, and you pay attention, you will hit a tennis ball better. If you see someone lead with compassion and love, you will lead with compassion and love in your life. And if you see someone stand up and talk about how they were diagnosed with Hashimoto's syndrome and they had to take medication for the rest of their life, and then they crossed the river of change and they turned that battleship around and they went through the dark night of the soul, and it took them 2 years to do it, but now they don't live on medications and they signal new genes in new ways, and all their hair came back and they don't sleep anymore, and they got a new hot Italian boyfriend and everything's going really well. A true story, by the way. You see someone talk like that, you give yourself permission to do the same. Would you agree? And so this is where my passion lies. This is, to me, the great work. This is where I want to be. I want to be with people that want to do it. I don't want to be with people who want to talk about it. I'm done talking about quantum superimposition. I've drank martinis to sunrise with scientists, and no one's changed at the end of it. We're just happy. So the concept is called information to transformation. This is the great work, because it begins to put the rubber to the road. And when people are able to do it, we can measure it. It gives us more information to teach it better the next time, and that's what I'm interested in doing. So, quickly, you have different types of brain waves. Beta brain waves is what you're in right now. You believe your outer world is more real than your inner world. When you change your brain waves, you move to alpha. That's the imaginary world, where the inner world starts becoming more real than the outer world. If you move into a state where your body is asleep and your mind is awake, now you're in what's called theta, and that's magic land. That's where transformation occurs. Delta is when you're asleep. And then when you see this fast pattern, it looks a lot like beta, but it's more of a compressed amplitude, you're looking at what's called gamma. We call that super consciousness, super awareness. The inner experience that's taking place is more real than any outer experience, and that's what begins to erase the past in the brain and body. We could say then the past no longer exists because the program is rewritten in that moment. So your conscious mind, for the most part, you're in beta and alpha. Most of you are in beta, you're listening to me, and then I develop a concept or I talk and you go like this. You move into alpha and you consolidate that information. But also, alpha is the inner world. This starts bridging on the subconscious realms. Theta and delta is when you are in the operating system. So then the only way that people can begin to make change is to begin to change their brainwave patterns. And we measured brainwave changes. Does that make sense? So you have coherent patterns in the brain. When you are open, when you're focused, when you feel whole, when you feel great, your brain is very organized. When you're living by the hormones of stress and you're freaked out and you're neurotic, your brain is in high beta and the patterns are very incoherent. That incoherent, that arrhythmic pattern in the different neurological networks is like a symphony that's out of tune. And that very incoherent message sends a very incoherent signal down the spinal cord, and then you have incoherence in your immune system, incoherence in your digestive system, and incoherence in every other system in your body. Does that make sense? So then a laser is very coherent. Lights that come off the ceiling here are very incoherent. So when we begin our meditations, we begin to open our focus. And when we open our focus and begin to focus on nothing, no thing, the moment you take your attention off the particle and put it on the wave, you go from an disintegrated message to a very whole message. And when you start experiencing wholeness in the brain, different compartments of the brain that were no longer talking to each other begin to talk to each other. And we saw in so many people, when we were looking at their brain, the front of the brain talking to the back of the brain, the right side talking to the left side, they started to experience a greater level of synchrony. And what syncs together in the brain links together. And the only experience that people have is they say, I feel whole, I feel satisfied, I feel complete, I'm in love with life. And that is the natural state of being. And when we saw all those people in the last 2 advanced workshops heal themselves of genetic disorders that medical science had no solution for, I learned something really important. That every one of those people became so whole and so happy with themselves, they could care less if they had the disease any longer, and that's the moment it went away. We saw it over and over again. Now, we say in our work that coherence is health, and that all disease is a lowering of frequency, and it's incoherence. Incoherence is an arrhythmic pattern. It's like a group of people that are all playing the drums at the same time, and they're all playing out of rhythm. Now, when you create a coherent signal over an incoherent signal, you'll begin to entrain matter to a new mind. And if you do it properly, you'll create coherence and orderliness in the body. How many people understand that? So if there's a group, listen, if there's a group of you playing the drums and you have no rhythm, and then the Sangoba tribe arrives from South Africa and they start banging on some drums, you're going to start playing with them. Would you agree? They're going to entrain you to their frequency. Yes? And so then, when you change your energy, you change your body. When you change your energy, you change your life. Now, this is a good example of synchronization. Shall we sound? All these are individual neurons and networks of neurons. Are they in rhythm or are they out of rhythm? So they're incoherent. There's a rhythm to the universe. How many people are seeing the entrainment? Now look at this rogue guy over here. He just doesn't want to get with the program. One stray neuron wanting to be angry. He can only resist for so long. Uh-oh, it's starting to waver. How many people understand coherence now? So when your brain is coherent, you're coherent. And when you get out of the way, when you're living by the hormones of stress, you become so object-focused, so narrow-focused, you obsess about one thing, one problem. You're selecting the same potential in the quantum field over and over again. And you're eliminating all other possibilities. And we now know that when people open their focus and they become aware of the space around their body and space, the brain gets very coherent. It gets very organized. It gets very rhythmic. And it begins to create more whole states, whole brain states. So we know that more elevated emotions like love and gratitude can begin to entrain slower emotions or more dense emotions. So when you live by the more dense emotions like anger or guilt or shame or competition, you're more matter and less energy. When you elevate your emotional state, you become more energy and less matter. And the survival emotions of stress tend to cause us to feel separate from possibility, and we define reality on our senses. We become materialists. The quantum model is about becoming an immaterialist. This is a machine called the Sputnik. I wanted to measure the energy in the room. I wanted to see if there was significant changes in the room, because people always say, oh, the energy was incredible. But I wanted to know if it was true. So this is the first day. Look at, we're about 3,800 joules. 3 days later at 5,200 joules. I said to the scientist, how significant is that? He said, we don't really see changes like that very often. Now, this is the second event we did in July. This is where we started. Look at the energy down here. Pretty droopy, yeah? We started the day high energy, then all of a sudden it tapered off again. We started the third day, look, it came down, and then it went way up, and then this is the evening, during the night. Now look at the last day. This is the high point, and then we had keynote speakers, and it dropped a little. But look where we started. Now, in my advanced workshops, we start at 6 in the morning. And we go to 6 at night. And you know what? You're in and out of meditation all day long, and you'll see these folks, they love it. Because they are having mystical experiences. So you have 3 types of ligands in your brain and body. Ligar means to bond in Latin. Neurotransmitters create mind, neuron to neuron. Neuropeptides create feelings, and those neuropeptides are signaling mechanisms that turn on different hormonal centers in the body. How many people understand that? We call these the energy centers. Your thoughts and feelings create your state of being. How you think and feel is who you are. If you think insecure thoughts and you feel insecure, sooner or later you say, I am insecure. So just pay attention to this for a minute. You fire a thought, my boss is unfair. I'm underpaid. I'm not appreciated. This doesn't have to be you, by the way. I'm overworked. These are thoughts that are connected to neurological networks. Nobody listens to me. You produce a level of mind. Mind is the brain in action. The moment those neurons fire in tandem, you get an internal representation, and that internal representation is who you believe you are. The moment the thought becomes the experience, all of a sudden the thought begins to produce an emotion. So it signals the amygdala. The amygdala is the angry center. It has neurons for aggression. The amygdala then activates the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus signals the pituitary, and you have a chemical and neurological signal that travels down to your body. It reaches the witless adrenal glands. The adrenal glands then squirt out the hormones of adrenaline and cortisol, and the moment that happens now, you're broadcasting a signal into the field saying, I am happy, send me another reason to be unhappy, send me another reason to be more angry. The moment you begin to feel angry, you have to think more thoughts equal to how you feel. How many people understand? So now you're thinking equal to how you feel, and you're just firing and wiring the same circuits over and over again, and you're beginning to create a box in your brain because it's the most commonly fired, neurologically wired set of circuits equal to how you're thinking and feeling. How many people understand? And people do this for 20 or 30 or 40 years. As a matter of fact, they get so good at it, they don't have to think about it any longer. They don't even know that they judge. They don't even know that they feel guilty. They don't even know that they feel insecure. It's just what feels familiar to them. And so the cycle goes on, and we can let this run, but you get the picture, yes? It turns on the adrenals, and you keep activating that third center, and you keep producing the same hormones. You keep signaling the same genes in the same way, and you keep doing this enough times, the body becomes the mind of anger, or now anger is stored in the body, it becomes implicit. So we measured energy centers. People bless their energy centers. This is the field around their body. These are the energy centers. We measure the alignment, or how well they work with each other, and we measure the size, or the amount of energy there. After 40 minutes of meditation, you could see that there's a significant change here. You got it? Look at this one here. This person's got a little trouble with the truth, but 40 minutes later, look what happened. I said to the scientist, how did they do that? He said they cannot do that with their conscious mind. They have to implant the thought in the autonomic nervous system, in the subconscious. They have to get beyond their conscious mind to do that. Now look at this person. She's pretty healthy, right? 40 minutes later, I want you to check this out. Look at the size of this one compared to this one. Look at the size of this one compared to this one. Look at the size of this one compared to this one. Look at the size of this one compared to this one. They are completely balanced. How many people get it? So then this is the energy field around people's bodies. You could see that over time, on our 77 people that we monitored, their energy kept going up every single day. This is more. Russians read from right to left. You see the 6 centers not even on the board. What happens now? Just about aligned. This is before. This is after. 40 minutes later. This is before. This is after. This blessing the centers with new information. Before, after. People are getting good at this. Would you agree? It's becoming a skill. Now, we then measured quantitative analysis with an electroencephalograph, and we wanted to measure what was going on in real time and before and after the event. So we had people go into meditation. We randomly selected certain people, 5 different people per meditation, and I wanted to see in real time what was taking place. Now, quickly, we were measuring what's called hyperarousal or hyperactivity. When you see thick red lines in a brain scan like this, it means the brain is anxious, it's vigilant, it's processing too much data. It's like it can't tune into the right channel. All the channels are playing simultaneously. The thicker the red band, the more standard deviations they're away from normal. Now, when you see blue and you see real dense blue, it means it's hypoactive, or there's no energy in the brain, or different compartments of the brain are not talking to each other. How many people understand that? Tell the person next to you that you're a genius neuroscientist, please. So now, check this out. This is a person who has a lot of what? Chatter going on in the brain. Would you agree? Now, look at the frontal lobe up here. The frontal lobe should be restraining all of this chatter, but the frontal lobe is blue, which means what? It's turned off. So the frontal lobe, the boss can't regulate the grunts. There's nobody there. So the brain's running out of control. 4 days later, after they finish the work, what happened to the brain? Totally normal. And you can see that they're processing dual brain activity here, the left and the right. That's a pretty amazing change. Now, this is a woman with Parkinson's disease. With Parkinson's disease, there's a deficiency in dopamine. Look at all of that hyperactivity in the brain. Upper motor neurons are firing out of control, and because of it, people have spastic paralysis. They have steppage problems. They have festination gait. They have pill rolling, involuntary tremors. This person, 4 days later, almost a normal brain, her tremors disappeared. This is what we call a QEEG analysis. When you see a lot of dark blue, it represents hypoactivity. It represents the brain really cooled off. When you see it really red like this, it means it's really hot and there's a lot of energy in the brain. Anything in between, green is normal, yellow is slightly towards the warm side, and light blue is a little bit more towards the cold side. You get the idea? So this is the woman with Parkinson's disease. Look at her brain. Look, what's going on in there? She has no energy in her brain to regulate her tremors. Does that make sense? 4 days after the meditation, look at all that green. Green is what? Normal. Now you see this down here in red? That represents anxiety, and that's the exact emotion that she experiences when her tremors come. When she controls her anxiety, she controls her tremors. Now check this out. This is May 9th. She continued doing the meditations after the event, and look what happened. Her brain continuously got better. Now, on June 3rd, guess what happened? Her mother died, and her sister had a stroke. What happened to her brain? A lot of red. She went into an anxious state, and she stopped doing her meditations. She came back. We told her to keep doing the meditations. She got back on the horse. On June 27th, what happened? It improved. Would you agree? And she kept doing her meditation, and look at now. It's almost a normal brain. July 13th, she has no tremors. Parkinson's disease don't exist. Isn't that cool? She healed it by thought alone. This is a man with a traumatic brain injury. He flew through the windshield, broke his neck. He's in a wheelchair. Look what's going on in his brain. Hypoactivity. He can't process thought very well. He's having difficulty with his language center. He has no energy to regulate his body. There's just no energy there. 4 days after the workshop, almost a normal brain. He stood up from his wheelchair after that event. I know some of you don't believe that. That's okay. This is his brain with the QEEG. See all that cold area in there? There's just not a lot of brain activity. 4 days later, what does green represent? Normal. They told me he was whitewater rafting 2 weeks later down a river in Idaho, and then he's sitting up at the dinner table unassisted, and now he's pushing weights with his legs and he's crawling. I think he's doing pretty good, don't you? Now, this is a CEO, a mother, an attorney, pretty important person. This is called intrusive thoughts. She's getting pictures in her mind, and then she's talking about those pictures. Do you ever do that? And then the more she talks about those pictures, the more she reinforces that vision. 4 days after a meditation, no anxiety. This is her brain with the EEG analysis. You see all of what we call Z-scores. See all this red? That's anxiety. 3 days later, normal brain. Now, here's her brain on April 8th. She continued doing her meditations. That is a normal brain, by the way, folks. Her anxiety is gone. This is February. This is the high end of beta. This is February 20th. A lot of red represents a lot of anxiety. Look what happens on February 23rd. Green brain, normal brain. We asked her to keep doing the meditations till April 8th. What do you see? No drugs, no surgeries, no procedures. She changed her internal state, and she memorized a new state of being. This is a normal brain scan called a strip chart. This is the frontal lobe area here. This is the parietal lobes here, the temporal lobes, and the visual cortex. That's a normal brain. This is a woman, all of a sudden, we're watching her during her meditation. All the frontal lobe is going into gamma. She had uterine fibroids. She bled 2 liters of blood every single menstruation. She had to wear Dizpensa. And so I randomly selected her to come up during a meditation, and I just said, you, come on up. And she was horrified. I didn't know why. And because we lay down at the end of our meditations in our advanced workshop, and she was afraid she was going to soil the ground because she got her period the night before. She's in the middle of her meditation, and all of a sudden I'm looking at her brain, and her brain's going into high gamma in her frontal lobe. We know what that means? The inner picture is way more real than anything in her outer experience, and she is in ecstasy. And those uterine fibroids healed, and she doesn't bleed at all. I was just in Austin, Texas with her 3 weeks ago, and it hasn't happened since. Okay. This is her brain a little later on. What's happening now? She's got a lot of activity in her frontal lobe. Look what's going on here. She's talking a lot about it, like, holy crap, this is amazing. And it keeps going, like an orgasm. She keeps having more activity in here. And exactly what it is. It's a cerebral orgasm. Now, watch her brain here. Check this out. We now know that when you see blue in this realm here, they start connecting to the quantum field. You see all this red in the frontal lobe means that they're in theta, but the inner experience is more real than the outer world. This is their connection pretty much to the subconscious. And all of a sudden, she's starting to process this information. She's saying, what is going on? I can't believe this experience. It's amazing. Now check out her brain here. Watch the bursts of red here. Boom. 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 Now, how do we know that's not anxiety? Because she's in bliss. We're watching her. And those fibroids and that bleeding was transformed because her past was rewritten after that experience. The body and the brain were no longer in the past. Now, this is a woman who's a very, very integrated musician. She's Russian. She lives in Amsterdam. This is her brain before meditation. She's got a little jet lag going on in here. This is her brain during meditation. Now, check out her brain. When I was looking at her in real time, look at her brain here. We watched her brain. There was so much energy in her brain that she was sobbing. She was in such bliss. And it wasn't like she was doing it. It was happening to her. And we measured the amount of energy in her brain. Look at this. 10 times the amount of normal. That's scientific history right there. And she's got this real strong level of coherence in the right temporal lobe, which is the mystical center. And she is having a mystical moment. Beyond words. She's trying to understand what's going on, but she's storing that as long-term memory because the amygdala and the hippocampus store long-term memories. Here it is right here. That's the hippocampus and the amygdala. Now, we measured her brain in February, and then we measured her at the second event in July. Look what's going on. It's that much energy in her brain. She is in love with life. And all she keeps saying is, I am so in love with everybody and everything right now. Look at her brain on the high end of beta there. She is in ecstasy. This is normal brain activity. Now check out this woman. She's having a full-on kundalini. Her entire brain is in gamma. I was watching that woman, and she said, another one of those and I don't need a husband. Check this out. Woman living a normal life, all of a sudden she has an inner experience. We could measure that. Look at the amplitude here. It's about 5 times normal. Check this guy out. This guy was having an inner experience, and he has a second-generation Holocaust survivor. He felt all this suffering and all this pain. He was rooted to his culture, rooted to his past, and all of a sudden he said something clicked, and he just had this emotion of forgiveness for everybody and everything, all the dictatorship, everything, and he wasn't making that up. He couldn't do this on command. It was happening to him. And that experience changed him forever. He is a different person today. How many people understand? So then we measured heart coherence. Now, heart coherence, your heart rate varies from moment to moment, but look at this person, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50 minutes, their heart is in coherence. They're opening their heart, they're feeling gratitude, they're feeling appreciation in the meditation. We go to the next meditation, they do it again. That's 40 minutes where they're beginning to develop a skill. They're making it easy. Here she goes again. She moves into coherence again for about 55 minutes. Now check this out. I said to her, what happened down here? She said, I was going to bed. I just laid down. I was so in love with myself and my life. I wasn't even in meditation. I just felt incredible. And we measured that while she was laying down in bed. That's an hour of total heart coherence. Her heart is open. She feels selfless. She feels connected to something greater. She's in love with life. Now, this is a very weak EEG reading, but look what happens right here. See how the person goes into coherence? Now, check this out. A different person, right at the exact time, goes into coherence in the same meditation. A different person at the exact same time goes into coherence in the same meditation. A different person goes into coherence at the exact same time in the same meditation. Another person goes into coherence at the exact same time in the same meditation. Another person goes into coherence again. Can you start seeing a pattern here? In other words, and when one person begins to change their state, they entrain others. Isn't that cool? So when you have heart coherence, you have brain coherence. We say in our advanced workshops, the brain thinks, but the heart knows. You got it? Thanks for listening. I want to talk to you today about the fundamental principles of meditation. I want to talk to you about this idealism that has been pretty much, given from generation to generation in spiritual practices that have given people the ability to overcome immediate things in their environment, to literally pull off the miraculous. We finished the conversation this morning with our definition of a miracle. A miracle is basically something that exists outside of convention, whether it's social convention, religious convention, scientific convention, something that's happening outside the current belief systems. And when something happens outside of people's beliefs, we call that a miracle. By the way, those people who embarked on the miraculous were always considered foolhardy and insane until they pulled it off. And then what? Then they were saints and geniuses, and they were people that are exalted. So would you agree then that in order for you to do the uncommon in your life, you have to address what you believe? And would you agree then that there would be a certain portion of you that has to be willing to abandon the conventional idealisms that you presently have in order to do something unusual? And would you agree then that if conventional science already figured this out, we would be doing the miraculous? So that means then that you're going to have to be willing to look a little unpredictable, to look a little bit unusual, and to go against convention. And when we take that journey, we challenge the current beliefs first within ourselves, but then we challenge the beliefs in others. And that's a good thing. Now, if you take a thought, and you string a thought, and a thought together, and thoughts, by the way, are usually connected to a feeling. So if you have thought and a feeling, a thought and a feeling, a thought and a feeling, and if you have a series of good thoughts that are connected to a series of good feelings, a thought and a feeling, a thought and a feeling, a thought and a feeling is called an attitude. So you have a good attitude. And if you have a series of thoughts that aren't so good, they don't feel good, and you have a negative thought that's connected to a negative feeling, well, the repetition of thinking and feeling in that way creates what we call a bad attitude. So an attitude is just a series of thoughts that are connected to a feeling that are strung together. Now, if you take an attitude, and you string an attitude and an attitude and an attitude and an attitude together, that's called a belief. Now think about this. A belief is just something you keep thinking over and over again. Would you agree? And if we keep firing and wiring the same thoughts over and over again, would you agree then our beliefs are hardwired circuits in our brain that literally cause us to see reality a certain way? So would you agree then that there is a neurological component to your present beliefs? And would you agree then if an attitude is a series of thoughts and feelings running in a sequence, that the very definition of a feeling is the end product of a past experience? And we said earlier this morning that we can remember experiences better because we can remember how they feel. And so if you're feeling the same feelings every day is connected to the same thoughts, the feeling that you keep having begins to condition the body to memorize that particular emotion. So then, a belief then has an emotional component to it. And when something doesn't feel right, because it's outside of the memory of emotion that's connected to a past experience, we typically bump it off. Jesus was married? Are you kidding me? That doesn't feel right. So it's outside our current beliefs. If we can't have an emotional component that's connected to a belief, if we can't strain it through our emotional perception, then we bump that belief off. So would you agree then, if you condition the body through thinking and feeling in certain ways to memorize emotions, that on a gut level, beliefs have a very gut feeling? And so the person then, when they challenge their beliefs, they challenge the very boundaries of the emotions that they've memorized as the self. Which means to step outside the boundaries of your belief system means you have to challenge your personality, your very state of being, your identity. And when you break outside of belief, what most people do is they begin to look around to see if anybody's believing what they're believing. But you can't do that because everybody in your life that you live with, in your world, you have an emotional agreement with. You have an emotional contract with them. You meet someone for the first time and you say, "Hey, what's your name?" "Chandra." "I'm Joe." "Where are you from?" "Michigan." "Place." "I was just in Michigan 2 weeks ago." "Time." 2 weeks ago. Were you there?" "Hey, I know these people." Say you know those people too. You know those people? People. "And I went to that wedding, event, experience." "You went to that wedding too?" "You did." "I like you." If we experience the same experiences, do we share the same emotions? Yes. And if we share the same emotions, do we share the same energy? And as long as you don't change, we're going to have a great relationship. Now listen. Just like a sodium ion and a chloride ion. You okay with being sodium? Just like a sodium ion and a chloride ion, we have a bond that exists beyond time and space. We are energetically bound. And every person in your life, everything in your life, every experience, anything in your external world that you interacted with, your energy is laid on. And you have a bond with those things. So when you go against your current beliefs, you begin to break those emotional agreements with everything in your environment, and people begin to look to see where they can get some information that's going to be congruent with their change. But everybody in their life is saying, "Hey, we used to suffer together. Come on, you're going to change now? Who am I going to suffer with? I'd rather suffer with you than anybody. I like you better the other way." Thanks. So would you agree then, when you change your beliefs, you break your emotional agreements with everything in your world? And I want you to understand that there is an element of discomfort that's created by that. Because you begin to break that chemical continuity of that memorized self. Now, if you take a group of beliefs and you string beliefs and beliefs and beliefs and beliefs together, that's called perception. And our perceptions define reality. It is the choices we make in relationships, the things we create, the behaviors that we demonstrate. It all has to do with how we live our life. So then, if you were able to change a belief, would you agree then that you would have to change the way you think and feel? You would literally have to change the wiring in your brain and the chemistry in your body. And is it possible when you make a change in a belief that your neurocircuitry would change? Would your biology change? Would your chemistry change? Would your gene expression change? Well, why is it that when a person moves into a state of religious ecstasy, they can chew on glass? Doesn't that transcend biology? Why is it that when they move into a state of certainty and absoluteness, they can get bit by a rattlesnake with no effects? It is their belief that does that. Would you agree? So then, we're demystifying meditation today. And I want to demystify it in such a way that it makes it very practical for you to apply to your life. All of this information we talked about this morning is only available to you if you're actually going to do something with it. Otherwise, it's just good dinner conversation. Nobody's changed by it. So are you willing to go outside of convention and to be an example of this information? Because it's not going to come from the scientific community. By the way, we should never wait for science to give us permission to do the uncommon. We should go out and do the uncommon and do it repeatedly until, if you can do anything repeatedly, it begins to become a law. Would you agree? And then science has to come and study you and say, what exactly are you doing in there that's producing that result outside of you? Would you agree? So all of this information this weekend is to give you the opportunity to step outside the familiar, step outside the predictable, step outside the unknown. And most people then, they spend the majority of their time embracing the same circumstances, which creates the same level of mind, which keeps creating the same level of reality. So how do we then begin to make changes in the brain and the body so that the brain and body begin to change ahead of the environment? That is the real purpose of meditation, to cultivate a new level of mind. The word meditation in Sanskrit means to cultivate. So here come these mystics and holy men down from the Himalayas, and they're walking through the fertile valleys, and people are sick and they're starving, and these guys come out and women come out and they perform all these miracles. And then the people say, how did you do that? And they say, in the language of the understanding of those farmers, you have to cultivate up the old self and plant a new self. So, if you were planting a garden, would you agree that if you left the plants from the past, the year before, and the weeds that went unnoticed and unattended by you to begin to grow, and you didn't break the soil down and fertilize it, and you cast seed on that garden, tell me what type of fruit you would bear? Very little, right? But if you pulled out the past plants and you took out those weeds of those thoughts that you weren't attending to, and you broke the soil down and prepared it for a new mind, would you agree that when you planted it on fertile soil, you would produce a better result? So to cultivate, to dig up the old self, and to plant a new self is literally the model of change, which means in the process of meditation, you have to retreat from your life. You can't go out into your life and embrace the same conditions, because those conditions with the same level of mind will only reinforce those conditions. So the purpose of meditation then is to retreat from your life, to get beyond the familiar, and then to eliminate those sensual or sensory inputs from everything you're seeing and smelling and tasting and feeling and hearing, to put the body away and to begin to pay attention to those thoughts that go by unnoticed by you because you're too distracted by your environment, too distracted by your senses. And then to get beyond that analytical mind, to get beyond that critical mind that's telling you can't, that's telling you it's too difficult, that's telling you you'll never change, that analytical mind that's always working. Now, there was a researcher in the 60s who did an experiment where he hooked his brain up to electrodes, and every single day, he tried to change his brainwave patterns to move into that alpha state, which is the beginning meditative state. And so he burned incense, he did alternate nostril breathing, he chanted, he did his best to meditate, did all these things, and every single day his brainwaves stayed exactly the same. On the last day, the 13th day, luckily he had his brain hooked up to the electrodes, and he said, forget it. You can never change your brainwaves. And the moment he said, forget it, guess what happened? He went right into alpha. And so it began the process of discovery of how we get beyond the analytical mind. Now, your analytical mind is always evaluating the environment to determine what feels good and want to move closer to that, and what feels bad and want to move away from that. Oh my God, he reminds me of my ex-husband. I'm going to go this way. We begin to define reality based on knowns. The meditative process says that there is a way to get beyond the analytical mind, which separates the conscious mind to the subconscious mind, to begin to make those changes. So I want to talk to you about that today, okay? I want to talk to you about this because I want you to understand, to enter the kingdom of heaven, you must be a child. When children are born, they're pretty much totally subconscious mind. And the reason we know that is because a child's brain waves are literally in delta from the first 2 years of life, which mean the information that they're processing is that their brain is in delta. They're asleep with their eyes open. And that's why a child can't stay awake for more than a couple hours at a time before it falls back asleep, because their body's in that low-level thinking frequency. Between the ages of 2 and 6, brainwave patterns naturally and genetically pick up into theta. Now, theta is literally when your body is asleep, but your mind is awake. And when you've had mystical experiences, out-of-body experiences, lucid dreams, you've had instantaneous healings, it usually happens in this theta state. In this theta state now, we could say that the internal world is more real than the external world. And that's why when you tell a little kid to act like a rabbit when she's 3 years old or 4 years old, you tell her to do that at 9 in the morning, and it's 5 in the afternoon, and you're still stepping over her, and she's still a rabbit. Why? Because the internal world is more real than the external world. The imaginary world is more real than the external world. The mind, the internal mind, is more real than the external environment. And this is a lot of Lipton's work. Right around the ages of 6 and 12, you begin to form what's called the analytical mind, because brain waves pick up. As brain waves begin to pick up, the alpha state is that light, imaginative, creative state. Rudolf Steiner's job in his interest was to elongate alpha for as long as possible with children, because after a certain point, they're going to move into a very fast brainwave pattern called beta. And so, right around the ages of 6 and 12, children begin to develop this analytical mind because they begin to learn the laws of the environment. Now, my 22-year-old son's an engineer, almost an engineer, and he just one day came up to me when he was 10, and he said, I've been thinking a lot about Santa Claus. And I figured out that there's, a couple billion kids. There's only a certain amount of time. There's no way that Santa can be delivering presents to every one of these kids. And I said, yeah, but some of these kids are from the same family. How many kids are the average family? He asked me that question. So then he went back and thought about it a little bit more, and he said, no, Santa Claus still can't be. I said, why? He said, there's still not enough time. I said, yeah, but did you think about that part of the day is sunny and the other part of the earth is dark? So it's night at one time and day in the other. So if he's traveling in a certain direction, it's always going to be dark. Went back and thought about it again. No, there is no Santa. So he began to figure out the laws of the environment. You understand? Now, somewhere between the ages of 6 and 12, the brain moves into the neocortex. Your thinking brain is always processing sensory information from the environment. And the neocortex is what plugs you into reality. And when you begin to function in beta, which is your thinking brain, your brain is trying to create order between the external world and the internal world. It's trying to create meaning out of what's going on inside of you and outside of you. And so the brain is processing right now the information that I'm saying. It's wondering if it's too cold in the room. It's wondering if we're going to get a break. What is it going to change the slide? No, all this stuff is going on. And your brain has to make sense out of all of that. And because of that, the thinking brain is operating in a very high state. Now, look at low-level beta. This is when you're reading a book that you're enjoying, your brain waves are in low-level beta. When you get into mid-range beta, that's like when you're taking a test and you have to pay attention. It takes a little bit more energy, a little bit more effort, a little bit more of a moving out of your resting state. And that's right around 22 cycles per second to 16 cycles per second. Look at this, high-range beta. You know what high-range beta is? When you're freaked out, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. This is when you're in emergency mode in your life. This is when you are high stress. And when the brain is operating in this high-stress mechanism, it's like stepping on the gas and the clutch at the same time. And what happens to the brain when it's under these high levels of stress, the brain as an organ with 100 billion neurons wired together begins to compartmentalize. It's like a house divided against itself. The personality becomes fractured, and parts of the brain no longer communicate with each other. And that dissociative mechanism causes the personality to begin to fracture. So most people, when they're in this high range of beta, look, it's twice as high as mid-range beta. Their brain and body begin to run in a very, very disintegrated or disorderly fashion. Now, the brain is part of the central nervous system, and the brain has a spinal cord, which is an extension of it, and then it communicates with the digestive system, it communicates with the immune system, it communicates with the cardiovascular system, and because it's sending impulses to the body through the central nervous system, if there is disorderly messages coming from the brain, is there going to be disorderly messages going to the body? And as a result of that, you're going to see timing issues in digestion. You're going to see immune system weakness. You're going to see cardiovascular changes because the signals that are coming from the brain are very incoherent. Do you understand? So, let's talk a little bit about this. We said then that according to the model, when you're born, you're totally subconscious mind. We know that. So all the information that's coming in to the child's brain is unedited. And I do a lot of talks to pediatric conferences and places where we're talking about children's brains and wellness for children. We're not going to talk about it today, but I could talk extensively about it. Everything the child is perceiving in that moment, they're taking as the truth. So we begin to learn by these positive and negative identifications and associations. A good example of positive identification is when a child is young and cries out for milk. She notices a disruption in her internal order, and she cries out, and then when she gets her needs met by the mother, she learns to associate crying out with being fed. So if she does it over and over again, she'll begin to develop a habit or a behavior, and she'll associate the mother's voice or the smell of the milk with a change in her internal chemistry. And so that's a good example of a positive identification. A good example of a negative identification is when you're young and you put your finger on the hot stove. After a few times, you learn to associate that change in your internal chemistry, whatever it was that caused it, which was the stove. And you begin to associate that that isn't a smart move for you in the future because it's painful. And this begins to shape our very behaviors. So we learn by these positive and negative identifications and associations that give rise to what we call habits and behaviors. Now, you could say big boys don't cry. You could say women should be seen and not heard. You're not very good at math. Oh, you're a lot like your mother. And the child will take that information and it will encode it into the subconscious mind. So, right around the ages of 6 and 9, we said as brain waves begin to change, you begin to form the analytical mind or the critical mind. Now, the analytical mind acts as a barrier to separate the conscious mind from the subconscious mind. Now, your conscious mind is made up of 5% of your total mind. We talked about that this morning. And your conscious mind is made up of things like logic and reasoning, which gives rise to your creative abilities or your willpower. Your subconscious mind are all these positive and negative identifications and associations, which make up 95% of who you are. And we said, by the time you're 35, you are a set of memorized behaviors and emotional reactions that form what's called a personality. So the person tries to use 5% of their conscious mind to change 95% of what they've memorized subconsciously. Do you understand why change is so hard? So then we could say if you're using the ego to try to change the ego, it gets pretty difficult, wouldn't you say? So what is the purpose of meditation? The purpose of meditation is actually to get beyond this analytical mind. That analytical mind is always working. It's a protector. It's always going to try to predict the future moment based on the past moment. It's always going to tell you what's right and wrong, what's good and bad. It's always going to evaluate something so that it can be clear that in the next moment it's going to survive. And the more those chemicals of stress are running through the person's body and the higher the beta waves are, the more analytical the brain tends to be. So as we begin to move into the meditative process, the whole purpose of the meditative process is to get beyond the analytical mind into the subconscious mind and to begin to make those changes from those negative associations to more positive ones. If you're beyond the analytical mind, your brain waves will naturally begin to move into alpha. Now, there's techniques that are beginning to come about because we're beginning to see that if we actually hook people's brains up to certain electrodes, we can see what works and what doesn't. If the person's in beta and they think they're meditating, they're actually not meditating. They're thinking. And they're thinking in a high range. But when the person begins to move into a meditative state, the brain naturally goes into an alpha state. And when the brain begins to move into an orderly state, a very alpha state, it begins to get very coherent. And there's a very specific pattern that takes place. If there is a coherent signature in the brain from meditation, would you agree then, if the brain becomes more orderly and more coherent, it's sending a more coherent signal to the body? And what's happening to the immune system? It's getting more orderly. What's happening to the digestive system? Its timing is beginning to change. What happens to the cardiovascular system? Heart rate begins to slow down. And when we're beginning to do this in the meditative state, we're literally beginning to relax the body more into the present moment. So people then who do meditation and they move beyond the analytical mind, they're able to enter the operating system into the subconscious and make the best changes. Now, beta is normal thinking, right? If you begin to slow your brainwave patterns down and you eliminate the environment and you eliminate all the sensory information, your thinking brain will naturally move into alpha. If you allow yourself to move a little deeper, your brain will literally move into theta, and theta is when your body falls asleep, but your mind is awake. Now, reason this with me. This morning we said that we condition the body to be the mind by thinking and feeling in the same way. And the example that I used is you can't consciously remember a phone number, but you pick up the receiver and you look at it, and all of a sudden you're able to dial the number. How did you do that? You practiced it so many times that your body knew better than your brain. Now, 95% of who you are is a memorized set of behaviors and emotional reactions, perceptions and beliefs and conditioning. It's who you are. So, a person then who's memorized a certain state in which their bodies become the mind, and they move into theta, and the body begins to fall asleep and the mind is awake, would you agree that the body is no longer the mind? Now, this is when instantaneous change takes place, because the servant, which has become the master, has been put to sleep. And this is when people are able to make remarkable changes in their health and in their life. Now, the final state is delta. And delta is when your body is completely asleep and it's catatonic and there's no brainwave activity. And delta sleep is restorative sleep. Now, you fall down these steps every single night when you go to sleep. Some people go very quickly, some people go very slowly. And because you lay down and do this, it happens very naturally. In the workshops we teach people how to slide down these steps very slowly so they begin to become very familiar to them. So could you then sit up and allow your body to begin to slowly move through these levels? How many people here have noticed that when you're falling asleep sitting up, you go like this? That's your body, which is not used to sitting up when it's falling into alpha and theta to do that. But if you allow your body to do it enough times, it will fall asleep and sit still, and your mind will be awake. Now, when we get to that point, we enter into the subconscious. So alpha and beta are pretty much our conscious mind. Alpha, theta, and delta have a lot to do with the subconscious mind. So people say, I really can't meditate. And I say, really? Where do you meditate? In bed. If you meditate in bed and you go to sleep every night in bed, what are you going to do when you get in bed to meditate? You're going to go to sleep. That's the law of association and repetition. Get out of bed. Find a place where you can go that represents creation and change. And think about this. There are 2 times when the subconscious mind, the door to the subconscious mind opens. It opens first thing in the morning. Do you know why? Because you're climbing up these steps from delta to theta to alpha to beta. People say, what time do you get up to meditate? I say 4:30 in the morning. They say, 4:30 in the morning? Are you crazy? And I just know that at 4:30 in the morning, I'm still somewhere here. Do you understand? So it takes much less effort for me to slip into that state, because brain chemistry is primed for dreaming right around then. So the door to the subconscious opens in the morning when you wake up, because you got to climb up into beta, then you got to look at the person laying next to you and say, oh my God, I'm in this reality. Oh, there's the dresser that my grandmother gave me. Oh, okay. Oh, now I got to remember these problems. Oh, and then you come back to this reality. What if you woke up and remembered yourself as somebody else? Ooh. Now, I have friends in my life that are artists and painters and sculptors and playwriters, and they stay up till 2:30 in the morning. And they tell me, and by the way, Latinos too, and they say, listen, I'm not going to get up at 4:30 in the morning. I'm just going to bed at 4:30 in the morning. Now, these people, they slip down from beta to alpha to theta to delta at night, and they can hang in this stage at night, and that's when they write 3 chapters of their play. That's when they do all their painting. That's when they organize their room. They're in this alpha state, and they're in that imaginary world. So some people like to do their meditations before they go to bed because their brain chemistry is changing from serotonin, which is the daytime neurotransmitter that's picking up light. When you're perceiving light outside, your brain the receptors in your eye are picking up a certain amount of light, and it's causing the pineal gland to begin to make serotonin. As the brain chemistry changes because it gets dark, serotonin is naturally turned into melatonin, and melatonin is the dreaming neurotransmitter. That's what begins to allow your body to get tired and fall asleep. But melatonin can be turned into so many magical chemicals. And those chemicals are profound chemicals that, there's branches and families of them that are the most strongest antioxidants known to man. Some of them the most powerful hallucinogenics that your brain fabricates. There are phospholuminescent chemicals that are found, the same chemicals found in an electric eel where the brain lights up from the inside. Same chemicals that cause hibernation in animals where you have decreased appetite and decreased gonadal activity for hibernation. So the caterpillar can dream to be a butterfly, or the bear can put itself to sleep during the winter. All of these chemicals are important for that vision, that internal world, so that we can no longer be bothered by our body, to have those vivid and lucid experiences that begin to become the very blueprints of our destiny. So some people then would rather spend their time doing the meditation in the evening, because it's when their body is becoming tired and it no longer wants to be the mind. And that then, of course, allows the door to enter into the subconscious, and that's when we can make the most measurable changes. So, most people then think that meditation is something where you still your mind. Well, meditation is an element of stilling your mind, because when we talked about this afternoon that you live in two states of mind. You live in that stress state, that high emergency state. You live in that addictive chemical state in which the brain is amped up and it's trying to protect itself in the external world. Or we live in a state of creation. When we're in that state of creation instead of survival, when we're truly in that focused meditative state, there is no body, there is no thing, there is no time. We move into that place where the brain becomes blank. Now, how does that happen? From functional brain scans, people who are excellent at meditation, Tibetan monks, nuns that pray, when they're truly focused and they're truly paying attention, the frontal lobe is the crowning achievement of the human being. It acts like a volume control. And when you're truly paying attention and when you're truly creating, your frontal lobe doesn't want to be distracted by any other information. It wants to pay attention to what it's doing. So when a person's in a meditative state and you're making thought more real than anything else, there comes a moment when the CEO, the boss, the symphony leader, takes center stage, and the forebrain begins to quiet down the rest of the brain so nothing else is being processed but a single-minded thought. The moment that that happens, the symphony leader begins to quiet down the circuits in the motor cortex in the brain. It begins to slow down brain activity in the movement centers, and guess what happens to you? You become very still. If there's no brain activity in the motor cortex, there's no longer any mind. If it slows down the activity in the sensory cortex in your brain, the sensory strip, guess what happens next? You no longer feel your body. And if you're no longer feeling your body, would you agree then you're no longer your body? And then it cools off the circuits in the parietal lobe that have to do with time and space. And if you shut out the circuits in the brain to process time, would you agree there's no mind that's processing time? It means there is no time any longer? Come on. And if you cooled off the circuits in the association centers in your temporal lobe, where you are actually involved in associating with your problems and the people in your life and all the things that you do, if you turned out the lights in that area of the brain, you would lose track of your identity. Would you agree? Now, the moment that that happens, the thought that you're thinking about or you're processing or intending on literally becomes the experience. And your brain processes the thought as the experience, and that brain begins to change to look like the experience has already happened. So, would you agree then that if you're doing a meditation and you're doing a creative process, and when you finish the creative process, you're the same person that started, that nothing's fundamentally happened? Would you agree then that if you were able to come out of your resting state and change something about yourself, you're different after you finished than when you started, that there could be a good possibility that you reorganized circuitry in your brain to look like the experience has already happened? That's the privilege of being a human being. And can you fall in love with that future reality without any physical evidence yet? So much so that your body, as the unconscious mind, begins to believe that future event is happening now? And wouldn't you agree that the only way you're able to do that is to eliminate the environment, eliminate that critic in your mind that's always telling you can't do it? Because right on the other side of your suffering is freedom. Right on the other side of your pain is joy. Right on the other side of your self-doubt is courage. It's right on the other side. And so people say, oh my God, that's nonsense. And you would say, that's right, it is beyond my senses. It hasn't happened yet, but it will. Our senses should be the last to experience what our mind has created. And then someone would say, oh, she's so unrealistic. That's right. That reality hasn't happened yet, but it's alive in my mind. So can you believe in a future that you can't see or experience with your senses yet, but you've thought about enough times in your mind that your brain has literally changed to look like the event has already happened? Can you then fall in love with a future potential that exists in the quantum field and give thanks for the experience ahead of the actual event so many times that you condition your body to change, to look like the event has already happened? Because when your brain and body begin to change ahead of the actual event, that's when the event finds you. And it will always come in a way that you least expect, that surprises you. So people say, is it true that you can change your brain to look like the event has happened? If you take a group of people that never played the piano before, and you teach them one-handed scales and chords, and they practice 2 hours a day for 5 days, and you do a functional brain scan before they do the activity and after, the people who physically rehearse the scales and chords will grow a whole new set of circuits on the opposite side of the brain. Why? If you learn something, you make new connections. If you repeat what you're doing, reinforces those connections. If you get some instruction on how to do it, you get your body involved. You produce an experience, more neurons organize themselves. And you pay attention over and over again, you're going to grow new circuits. But if you tell a group of people to mentally rehearse playing those scales and chords, to actually, in their mind, rehearse playing the scales and chords, at the end of 5 days, those people have the same amount of circuits grown in their brain as the people who physically demonstrated it. We could say, then, that the brain changed ahead of the actual event. The brain looked like it had been playing the piano for 5 days. The brain had hardware installed in it to look like the physical event had been happening for 5 days, but they never touched the keys. Would you say that they were ahead of time now? They were ahead of the condition. And so you'd say, well, that's really good dinner conversation, Joe. I'm impressed, but it didn't change the body. If you take a group of people and you ask them to pull a spring for an hour a day for 4 weeks, at the end of 4 weeks, they're going to have a 30% increase in muscle strength. Why? There's a load on a muscle, there's resistance, the muscle tears, and when it grows back bigger. Does that make sense? It's normal physiology. But you take a control group and you have them mentally rehearse in their mind pulling that spring, and at the end of 4 weeks, there is a 22% increase in muscle strength. They never lifted a finger. Now the brain and body have changed to look like the physical event has been happening. In other words, their body looked like it was already having the experience. Now, if your brain and body changed to look like the event has already happened, what is the signal that's created in the quantum field? The event has already physically taken place because there's evidence physically in your body. So my daughter, I have children, and my children grew up with these concepts from the time they were very young. And all of my children have to work on something in their life to produce an effect by using universal mind. Now, my children will tell you that there's an intelligence within you that gives you life. As a matter of fact, I was on a plane last night and I was thinking about my son, who's my oldest son, and I was remembering when I picked him up from school one time and he was, 8 years old, and he said, Dad, they passed out a survey today, and they asked what religion I was, and it said like Catholic and Protestant, and it said Jewish and Buddhist and Muslim, and it had all these different ones. And what religion are we anyway? So I launched into this whole thing about there's an intelligence within you that's both personal and universal. It's within you and all around you, and that it's beyond the senses and all this stuff, and gave him the whole quantum model of reality, and went on for 20 minutes, and he just kind of sat there. And then when I finished, he looked over at me and said, "So I should have checked other, huh?" So my kids will tell you that there's an intelligence that's within you and all around you, that's giving you life. That's both personal and universal. The same intelligence that's digesting your food that you just ate. The same intelligence that's causing 2 gallons of blood to be pumped per minute through your body. 100 gallons of blood in 1 hour. 100,000 times in one day through 60,000 miles of blood vessels. They'll tell you that that mind has a mind that's so much bigger than your mind and my mind. They'll tell you that if you lose 10 million cells every second, this intelligence makes another 10 million cells. It has a will that's so much greater than my will and your will. And that in 1 single second, in 1 cell of your body, it goes through the order of 100,000 chemical reactions in 1 second. Now multiply that by the 70 trillion cells that you make, and the information that's taking place is happening faster than the speed of light. And you would say, well, that's my autonomic nervous system doing that. Really? And what part of your autonomic nervous system? Oh, that's my limbic brain. Oh, you mean that organelle, the brain, and that little limbic system of the brain controls the beating of your heart? That's right. Are there tissues in there that do that? Yeah, there's tissues. So there's tissues that organize into organelles, that organize into organs, that organize into systems, that keep my heart beating? Absolutely. And are there cells in those tissues with specific nuclei? Yeah. So there are cells that organize into tissues, into organelles, into organs, into systems. That's right. And then what's making the chemicals in the cells do what they do? The molecules. Oh, the molecules make chemicals that make cells, that make tissues, that make organs, that make organelles, the systems of my body. That's right. That's what's keeping the beating of my heart. That's right. And what are those molecules made out of? Atoms. Now, what is an atom? An atom is 99.999% nothing. They look absolutely real, don't they? But they're 99.99% empty space. That's generating a field that's sending and receiving information all of the time. Your body's gravitationally organized energy into patterns of information. And you, by the way, move in and out of the quantum field 7.8 times per second. You're blipping in and out 7.8 times per second. And every time you blip out, you gain information and you come back in. But the information you gain when you go out is based on the last thought and the last feeling you had. So you keep drawing the same information from the field over and over again. So think about this. If this intelligence is more than you and I, if we're less than 1%, that this invisible force is actually what's giving us life. It's a frequency, and frequency carries information. And it organizes into patterns that we call reality. So would you agree then that that same intelligence that's keeping your heartbeat and digesting your food is the quantum field that's actually causing supernovas to be born in distant galaxies, that's forcing a lily into bloom? It's both within you and around you. So can you develop a relationship with this intelligence? And if it's a consciousness, does it have awareness? And if it has awareness, is it paying attention to you? Come on. Yeah. So would you agree then that if you began to interact with it, and you began to ask it to move in you, to move through you, and to move all around you, that you should see evidence in your world? Yes. And could you develop a relationship with it like you do with your husband or your wife or your lover or your dog or your cat or your kids or your pain? Could you put that much attention on it? And if you could develop a relationship with it, could you have a two-way relationship? Yes. So my children understand this. And they all work on something in their life that they want Universal Mind to begin to organize for them. So my daughter is probably the greatest creator that I've ever come across in my life. She just gets that your thoughts and feelings create your reality. She just doesn't know any other way. And so she always appears and she says, "Hey, Dad, you know, I'm thinking of working on this thing." And then I always go, "Really? You're going to perform this? You're going to create this?" Yeah. Now, she's been in music videos. She's spent summers in New York on scholarships because she wanted to spend the summer in New York, and she didn't know how it was going to happen, and she won a scholarship. She didn't even apply for the scholarship. She's had unlimited shopping sprees where she spent $7,500. Look at the ladies, they're all going, "What?" But she was home in the summer, just a little ways back, and she said, "Now, Dad, I want to get a job." And I thought, oh my God, this is great, a job. She said, "But I don't want to get the typical job. I don't want to do the typical things. I want to do something else. I don't want to hostess or waitress. I don't want to be confined to a certain area. I want to travel. I want to go to Europe. I want to do something new. I want to learn something new. I want to travel to at least 5 different cities. And then the last week, I want to be in Florence to see some of my friends. I want to go for about a month and a half, and then I want to be back by the end of July to spend the summer on the ranch with you." And I thought, oh, this should be good. So I said, okay, you have to go into that meditative state, and just like the piano players, you got to make a new mind. You got to make that brain fire in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations, and you got to reinforce those circuits every single day and remind yourself of that future potential that already exists. You have to install the hardware so that your brain looks like it just had the most amazing summer of its life. She said, no problem. And I said, but that's not enough. You have to emotionally condition your body to begin to have it, to believe that it already has had that amazing summer, so much so that your body begins to emotionally believe that future event is happening right in that moment during your meditation. She said, no problem. I said, and if you finish your meditation and you open your eyes and you're the same person that closed them, nothing's happened. Nothing's happened in the quantum field. Nothing happened neurologically. Nothing's happened biologically. Nothing's happened chemically. Nothing's happened genetically. Your body has to begin to believe emotionally that event has already happened. Thoughts are the language of the brain. Feelings are the language of the body. And you have to get up feeling differently than when you started. She said, I don't have a problem with that. So every day she practiced over and over again. Now, the beauty behind it, all she was doing was she was changing her mind and body in the meditation. She was rehearsing like the piano players. She was rehearsing like the spring pullers. And she was changing her body ahead of the actual event. 2 weeks later, she calls me up and she said, oh, listen, Dad, you know, there's an opportunity for me to go to Europe. It's going to cost me $7,000, and I can use my wild card credits at college and get it down to $4,000. I got to buy a plane ticket, and then I got to do that. And I said, her name is Jana, we call her Gij. I said, Gij, that's not it. You're trying to control the outcome here. You're trying to force that destiny. That's not it. Go back and do it again. And I said, if you want to live for 6 or 8 weeks in Europe, you make sure that your body begins to believe it already happened. So she went back and she did it over and over again. And weeks later, she's in the library in the university. And she's copying pictures from her art history book. And she's copying these pictures of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And she spent a summer there studying art. And as she's copying the pictures, here comes her art history teacher walking by. And they start talking. And they start talking about the Uffizi Gallery. And my daughter said, oh, I've been there several times. They get in this conversation. And then the art history teacher starts talking Italian to my daughter. My daughter speaks Italian. She starts talking Italian back. And the art history teacher says, listen, come with me. And she grabs my daughter and escorts her across the campus and takes her to the chair of the Italian department, sits her down, and she says, I think I found your person. And the Italian teacher talks to my daughter for a few minutes and says, listen, I need a personal assistant. We have to go to Italy. I have to teach kids, American kids, Italian, but I'm going to teach them level 2, and I need a person to teach them level 1. I need a personal assistant to do that. We're going to travel to 6 cities in 7 weeks, and we're going to spend our last week in Florence before we go home. All expenses paid, and you have a job. And I said to my daughter, that's more like it. So, would you agree then? She did not try to figure out where it was going to come from the second time. She just changed the way she thought and felt, and then she left the details up to a greater mind to organize it in a way that was right for her. So if she was the same person when she finished the meditation as she started, would you agree then that nothing changed biologically and neurologically? And there should be no evidence in her world. But if the body's physically changed, to look like the event has already happened, and biologically it's looking that way, then if the quantum field is a self-reflective field, wouldn't you agree then that if the body's physically changed to look like it's already had the experience has already happened? And it will come in a way that you least expect. So how would you live your life if you woke up in the morning and had your sights set for a future, and you began to condition your body to a new mind and organize the new circuitry in your brain to look like the experience has already happened? Would you get out of bed a little differently than if you got out of bed the same way as you always do and do the same things? So what is all of this information for this weekend? It's all for you. It's all for you to apply to your life. It's all for you to begin to take what you've learned intellectually and begin to apply it to your life to have a new experience. And when you have a new experience, that new experience produces a new emotion. And when you have the experience of healing somebody, you have the experience of creating a destiny you want, you have the experience of interacting with another world, another dimension, and that experience produces a new emotion, you are now teaching your body chemically what your mind has intellectually understood. And your body begins to get that information, and it begins to signal new genes in new ways. But if you are thinking and feeling the same way every single day and acting the same way, would you agree that you keep choosing the same destiny over and over again? Quantum model still applies, doesn't it? So all of this information is to create a new mind. But it's not enough to stop there. You have to do something with it. You have to demonstrate it. You have to move into a state of being. And when you move into that state of being where your body and brain are already changed, that means then you are generating a whole new electromagnetic signature. And all the potentials that exist in the quantum field exist as electromagnetic frequencies. Which means then, if you are living by the same energy field, you keep picking and choosing the same destiny. When you change your electromagnetic signature by changing the way you think and feel, that new electromagnetic signature matches the potential in the quantum field. And when there's a match inside with the match in the quantum field, your body is drawn to that event. Or better yet, the event finds you. So then, waking up in the morning or before you go to bed at night and reminding yourself what your destiny is. And reminding yourself how you no longer want to think, how you no longer want to act, and how you no longer want to feel begins to dismember or cultivate up the old self to become so conscious of it that you don't slip back into the same personality that's creating the same personal reality. And then if you remind yourself of who you do want to be, and you repeat it enough times and cultivate a new self, and you create from that change in energy, would you agree then, if you're fundamentally different than when you started, there should be evidence in your world? And if you could maintain a modified state of mind and body and memorize that internal order independent of the conditions in your life and no longer allow your senses to define reality, would you agree that something unusual is going to happen in your life as well? So let's talk about that. Because when you begin to go against the addictions of the emotions that you've created and memorized, your body's going to react. We know that the body begins to send signals back to the brain for you to return back to the old self. We know that if you just change your internal state and get happy, you can signal new genes just by getting happy, just by laughing. So you control your destiny. There's no doubt about that. Now listen to this guy.
I'm too weak, too slow, too big. I ate too much for breakfast. Got a headache. It's raining. My dog is sick. I can't right now. I'm not inspired. Makes me smell bad. I'm allergic to stuff. I'm fat. I'm thin. It's too hot. I'm not right. I've got shin splints, headache. I'm distracted. I'm exerting myself too much. I'd love to really, but I can't. I just can't. My favorite show is on. I got a case of the Mondays, the Tuesdays, the Wednesdays. I don't want to do this. I want to do something else. After New Year's. Next week. Might make a mistake. I got homework. Well, I feel bloated. I have gas. I got a hot date. My coach hates me. Mom won't let me. I bruise easily. It's too dark. It's too cold. My blister hurts. This is dangerous. Sorry, I don't have a bike. I didn't get enough sleep. My tummy hurts. It's not in my jeans. I don't want to look all tired out. I need a better coach. I don't like getting tackled. I have a stomach ache. I'm not the athletic type. I want to get sweaty. I have better things to do. I don't want to slow you down. I have to do this? As soon as I get a promotion, I think I'll sit this one out. And my feet hurt.
When you go about the business of change and you use feelings as a barometer for change, and you break that chemical continuity of how you're thinking and feeling, your body sends signals back to your brain, and you will hear all those things in your head. Would you agree? Now, just because you have a thought doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It's just a circuit that you fired and wired in your brain. The moment you believe it's true, it slips past the analytical mind, signals the brainstem to turn on the body for you to move into a state of being. Now, when people begin to change and they disrupt that chemical continuity of who they think they are, the body, which has become the mind, doesn't want to lose control, so it begins to talk to the brain. And people listen to these voices in their head as if they're true, and when they do, that's those subconscious programs rising to the surface so that the personality and the ego can return back to the familiar self. You and I have been hypnotized and conditioned into believing that we need a reason for joy or gratitude. But the true master is someone who can bring up the emotion ahead of the actual experience because they're falling in love with that destiny before the senses. When you begin to be able to bring up that amount of joy in your weakest hour, in your darkest moment, to be able to fall in love with that destiny and allow your body to emotionally begin to believe that future event is happening now, your life will change as a result of your efforts. Now, those chemicals of stress are highly addictive. They confuse the brain and body, and the brain begins to force signals back to the body, and the body sends signals back to the brain, and that addiction then causes us to act like an amped-up animal with a big memory bank. We go into a very predictable mode that's very animalistic. And as I said earlier today, those chemicals of stress create those selfish states of mind and body and endorse the ego to be self-centered and self-indulgent and self-serving and self-aggrandizing. And when we live in that selfish mode, we're focused on the body, the environment, and time. And the emotions of anger and aggression and hatred and fear and anxiety and pain and suffering, hopelessness and powerlessness, all of those emotions are driven by those stress hormones. If you look at a functional brain scan of someone who has anxiety, you know what they're doing, don't you? They're so focused on the worst case scenario in the future event. They're paying attention to it so much. They're mentally rehearsing just like those piano players and those spring pullers. They're allowing the thought to become so real that the body begins to produce the chemistry related to that future event now. And the body believes it's in that future event. And we condition the body to be in a state of fear or anxiety. And then we condition it so well that it becomes automatic, and the body gets anxious without the conscious mind. You can't control the panic attack any longer. You focus on a past bitter memory that's tattooed in the recesses of your gray matter, and like magic, in a moment it comes to life. And to us it's real. And when we begin to focus that intently on it, the thought becomes the experience. You are in a state of meditation. You are in a state of alpha. And when you do that, you become so focused on it that the brain freezes the thought as the experience, and it reinforces the circuitry. And the body then produces the chemistry that's connected to that past event. And the body begins to believe that that past event is happening over again. And we condition the body into a state of depression. And it becomes hopeless and powerless because we've trained it that way. So the person then is running through the airport because she has a presentation to do, and she's been missing meals, and she's been drinking coffee and staying up late and highly stressed and taking her kids all over, and she's a single parent. And she gets on the plane because she had to run through the airport. She had to drive fast on the shoulder of the road to get to the airport to present her most important presentation of her life. And she didn't want to miss her plane because there was traffic. And she gets to the plane and she sits down because she had to run through security and run to the gate. And the moment she sits down and gets stressed out and she starts to relax after all of that chemistry, she starts to notice that she has a panic attack. The moment she starts to see that visual narrowing and the halos around things and can't get her breath and her heart's beating erratically, she begins to notice her change in internal chemistry. And she pays attention to whatever outside of it is causing her. Is it the crowded places? Is it the airplane? She says, I have a fear of flying because I'm in this environment and it must be the environment that created it. Meanwhile, she forgot that she had been missing meals, that she's stressed out, that she's over-caffeinated. Her body was out of balance. So she goes to the doctor. The doctor says, oh my gosh, you know what? That's a hardware problem in your brain. That's molecules and chemicals. You see a chemical imbalance in your brain. And so here, take this drug to create chemical balance. So if she takes the drug, is she healed? You know why, don't you? She'll still avoid crowded places and airplanes. And in the absence of that chemical, she returns back to the old self. She's using the chemical to change the personality. So then she goes to the psychologist, and the psychologist says, oh, actually, it's not a hardware problem, it's a software problem. You see, your father was overbearing. And you are this way because your father was a perfectionist and he drove you to be this way. Now, even though she has the insight about the behavior, does it change her condition? She's still the same. Insight didn't change anything, right? So then what happens? She goes to the psychic. And the psychic says, you were a charismatic Christian in the 1500s. And you were burned at the stake in Carcassonne. Now, even though she has the insight about this, and the memory is burned in your soul, does it change the behavior? She's still the same person, would you agree? So then she goes to the astrologer. And the astrologer says, Mercury is where? In retrograde, right? Even though she understands that Mercury is in retrograde, does it heal her condition? So would you begin to see then that we have to get beyond ourselves in order to change? The purpose of meditation is to get beyond the self. They talk about self-love in the United States, oh, love yourself. And so people think, love yourself, get a pedicure, get a facial, get a new hairstyle, or get a new car. That's not self-love. That's pleasure. You know when self-love is born? When you wake up in the morning and those voices are happening in your head, which are old circuits that you fired and wired, and your body is breaking its addiction and it's sending signals back to the brain so you can return back to the same predictable self, and you say, you may not pass today. I'm taking this body and we're getting up and we're doing this. And you sit down then, and that body rages in fear. It rages in busyness. It rages in preoccupation. It rages in depression. It wants to be the mind. And you say to it, that's all you got? Because you know what? I'm not getting up until you're done. And then when you're done, I'm reconditioning you to a new mind. And we're going to get up happy. And you're going to be so happy that we did this. Now, when you condition your body to a new mind because you stay there in the presence of that unbridled stallion, that horse that's bucking and kicking, and you bring it into the present moment, and every time you bring it in the present moment, you break that addiction a little bit more. And the body begins to become more trained. And when you break through the chains of your anger or your impatience or your busyness or your depression, and the body's liberated from that addiction, and breaks the chains, and energy is liberated into the field from the body, the absence of that addiction is called joy. And when you break through yourself and get beyond yourself, and you wake up in a new state of mind and body, and you're memorizing that state, and you face off with the people in your life that you used to knee-jerk to and have an emotional reaction to, you're no longer that addiction any longer, and you can love them. Because you can see who you used to be. You're no longer that emotional agreement any longer. The chloride ion and the sodium ion are now broken apart. And now you're headed to a new destiny. And when you break through from yourself, you learn to respect yourself and life and everybody else without that analytical mind. Because you've been putting it to rest every single day. When you overcome some aspect of you, and you move from that state of selfishness to that state of selflessness because you sat down. You didn't wait for crisis or trauma or tragedy to get about the business of change. You got up and did it in a state of joy and inspiration because you were happy to be alive. You wanted to head off your genetic destiny before it happened. That's the new model of creation. The old model is to wait for guilt and pain and suffering. The new model is you choose you. So Pavlov takes a dog and straps it to a table, volunteer by the way, and rings a bell and feeds it a delicious meal. Would you agree that in a matter of moments, after a few exposures, you ring the bell and the dog automatically salivates in anticipation of the event? It is a subconscious, automatic, autonomic function that transcends the conscious mind. if you have an addiction to some emotion, I want you to know that there's some person, some thing, some experience in your life that you keep reaffirming to reaffirm that addiction so you can remember who you are as an ego. Now, what if you go into your life every single day with the 5% of your conscious mind to want to change? Would you agree that if you haven't done the work in the subconscious, the moment you get in that environment and you see that person, just like Pavlov ringing a bell, you're going to start to physiologically change ahead of the actual experience, and your body's physiologically returning back to the old self because that's what's driving the machine. So if you're addicted to that emotion and you're using that person to reaffirm that addiction, and you sat down and you say to that body, we are going to get beyond this today. We're not getting up until we're somebody else. And that body bucks and kicks, and you break through a little bit more. Would you agree then, if that emotion is no longer in you, then you can sit in your environment, and the environment no longer draws you physiologically or unconsciously back to the old self? Would you agree? So if you're addicted to chocolate, and I slid a chocolate cake in front of you, would you agree that in a matter of seconds you start hearing those voices and you start salivating and say, ooh, I think I'll start tomorrow. I'm going to have a little bite of this. No one's looking. It's the body doing that. But if you broke your addiction to chocolate, I could slide the cake in front of you and you could eat it or not eat it. Would you agree? Yes. So the purpose of meditation then is to prime the brain and body so that you don't continuously return back to the old self unconsciously, physiologically. If the addiction is in you, then the addiction is connecting to something outside of you. And just like that sodium and chloride ion, we are bound by it. And energetically, we are connected to that destiny. When you pick a potential that exists in the quantum field and you create from a new identity, you're literally using your energy, and every single molecule is affected in that future. Your energy is in that future. Your energy is in every single atom in that future. So you would say to me, well, that sounds really good, but geez, I don't have the time to do this. When will you? So, in closing, this is a time in history where the common person changes themselves. They change themselves. And when you change yourself, and you're no longer knee-jerking to the same things any longer, would you agree that if you changed you, who gets to be the beneficiaries of that change? You do. And would you agree your family does? And your people you work with? And the community around you? And when you're showing up as a different energy means a different reality. And people say to you, did you lose weight? No. Did you change your hairstyle? No. Did you get a little work done? Mm-mm. No. Did you shave your mustache? Mm-mm. Wow, you're different. Because they're sensing who you are. So, you break that emotional addiction, and the body is liberated. The energy is freed from the body as the mind. And when the body is no longer the mind, then, we begin to no longer live in the past, but to live in the future. If you change your brain and body to look like the event has already happened ahead of the actual event, your brain and body are no longer a record of the past. They're now a map to the future. And to live by that law is to live by the quantum law. And the quantum law says the environment is an extension of your mind. You truly change your mind, your life changes. Thanks for listening. How many people in this audience believe in the idea that the way you think has some effect on your life? Like your thoughts create your reality? You do. Okay, so how many people here actually woke up this morning and consciously created a future? You know the biggest reason why you don't do it? Because you don't believe it's true. See, if you knew that it was absolutely true, would you ever miss a day? Come on. If you knew it was true, would you ever miss a day? And would you ever let any thought slip by your awareness that you didn't want to experience? So does the environment control your thinking, or does your thinking control your environment? Because your brain is organized to reflect everything you know in your life. Your brain is a record of your environment. It's an artifact of your past. So if you wake up in the morning and you get out of bed on the same exact side as you did the day before, shut the alarm clock off with the same finger, slip into your favorite shoes, your slippers, shuffle into the bathroom and use the toilet like you did the day before, then run over to the mirror and look at yourself to remember who you are, and then wash yourself in the shower in the same routine way, and then drink coffee out of your favorite mug, drive to work the same way you always do, see the same people that push the same emotional buttons, those people, and then do the things that you've memorized and can do so well, and then hurry up and go home so you could hurry up and check your emails, so you could hurry up and go to sleep, so you could hurry up and do it all over again. Let me ask you a question. Did your brain change at all that day? We could say that you were thinking the same thoughts, performing the same actions, living by the same experiences that created the same emotions, but nothing new was happening in your life. Now, the principle in neuroscience says that nerve cells that fire together wire together. So if you're thinking the same thoughts, performing the same actions that create the same experiences, that produce the same emotions, your brain is firing in the same sequences, in the same patterns, in the same combinations. And whenever you make your brain work, that's called mind. Mind is the brain in action. So you're reminding yourself who you think you are based on your experience of your external world. So then, as long as you're firing and wiring those same circuits in the same way, and you do it over and over again, your brain begins to fire in a very finite signature, a very finite pattern. And we can call that box in the brain your personality. To change, then, is to make the brain work in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations. And whenever you make your brain work differently, now you're changing your mind. Now, the one ingredient that allows you to do this so well is information. Every time you learn something new, you make a new synaptic connection in your brain. That's what learning is. Learning is forging new connections. Remembering is maintaining and sustaining those connections. So as you add a new stitch into the three-dimensional tapestry of your gray matter when you learn something new, and as you begin to think about and reflect what you learn, you're making your brain work in new and unusual ways, and now you're changing your mind. So then, if the environment is controlling your thinking, because you're waking up and doing the same things and thinking the same thoughts, we could say then it's the outer environment, your external world, that's turning on circuits in your brain, causing you to think equal to everything that you know. Everything that's the same and everything that's familiar. And if you're thinking the same way as the day before, wouldn't you agree then? Then what do you keep creating more of? Same life. Now, the quantum law of reality is still applying to you, but you're observing your world equal to the same level of mind. To change, to truly change, is to think greater than your environment, to think greater than the situations in your life, the circumstances in your world. And every great person in history knew this, whether it was William Wallace or Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Joan of Arc or Madame Curie. They all had a vision. They had an idea. They couldn't see it, couldn't smell it, couldn't taste it, couldn't feel it. But to them, it was alive in their mind. It was so alive in their mind that they began to live as if that future event was happening now, beyond their senses. So can you believe in a future that you can't see or experience with your senses yet, but you've thought about enough times in your mind that your brain is literally changed, physically changed, to look like that event has already happened? Neuroscience says it's possible. And can you fall in love with a future potential that already exists in the quantum field? And how many potentials exist in the quantum field? Infinite. So then, can you fall in love with a future potential that already exists in the quantum field and emotionally condition your body into believing that future event has already happened to such a degree that you're signaling new genes in new ways and your body is physically changed to look like the event has happened? Biology says it's possible. So if your brain and body have physical evidence to look like the event has already happened, then the event has already happened. Now hang on, because the event is going to find you. And it's going to come in a way that you least expect. Now geniuses, why would it come in a way that you least expect? Because if you can expect it, it's nothing new. It's got to rock your world. It's got to catch you off guard. And it has to leave no doubt with what you've been doing inside of you is producing some result outside of you. And when you notice that you produced an effect outside of you, you'll pay attention to what you did and you'll do it again. Now that's going quantum. That's called empowerment. So then you would have to agree then that when your brain and body are physically changed to look like the event has happened, they're no longer a record of the past, but now a map to the future. And to live by this law is to live by the quantum law. Now, the quantum law says your environment is an extension of your mind. And if you truly change your mind, there has to be evidence in your life. But if you wake up and see the same people and go to the same places and do the same things at the same time, your environment is turning on different circuits in your brain that cause you to think equal to everything you know. Reproducing the same level of mind, and your brain isn't changing at all that day. So your personality creates your personal reality. That's it. And your personality is made up of how you think, how you act, and how you feel. So the present personality who's sitting here today, called you, has created the present personal reality called your life. So would you agree then that if you wanted to create a new personal reality, want something to change in your life, that on a fundamental level, you would have to examine the thoughts that you're thinking and change those thoughts, the behaviors that you're demonstrating that turn into habits, and the emotions that you've memorized that have become part of your identity that has nothing to do with you. And most people try to create a new personal reality as the same personality, and it doesn't work. You literally have to become somebody else. So if science says that the human being processes about 60,000 thoughts in one day, and out of those 60,000 thoughts, 90% of those thoughts are the same thoughts as the day before. So would you agree then that the same thoughts will create the same choices? The same choices will create the same behaviors. The same behaviors will create the same experiences, and the same experiences will create the same emotions, and those emotions then will drive the same thoughts, and that's called karma. No mystery to karma. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. Karma is. We're not punished for our sins, we're punished by our sins. By reproducing the same level of mind every day and creating the same exact life equal to that mind. Now, every time you have a thought, you make a chemical. And if you have a great thought or an unlimited thought, you turn on a set of circuits in your brain in a very specific sequence, pattern, and combination that produces a level of mind that turns on another part of the brain that makes a chemical for you to feel exactly the way you were just thinking, great or unlimited. If you have a negative thought or an unhappy thought, you turn on a different set of circuits in your brain and a different sequence, pattern, and combination that produces a different level of mind as you fire and wire those circuits that turn on another part of the brain for you to feel exactly the way you were just thinking, negative or unhappy. Now, the moment you begin to feel the way you think, because the brain is in constant communication with your body, you begin to think the way you feel, which makes more chemicals for you to feel the way you think, and then think the way you feel, and feel the way you think, and think the way you feel. And some people do this for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And the cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking creates what I call a state of being. Now, a state of being is when your mind and body are working together, when your thoughts and feelings are aligned to a concept. Now, thoughts are the language of the brain, and feelings are the language of the body. And the redundancy of this cycle over time conditions the body to memorize that state of being as well as the conscious mind. And whenever the body knows as well as the mind, that's called a habit. A habit is when your body is your mind. Now, 95% of who you are by the time you're 35 years old is a set of memorized behaviors, emotional reactions, beliefs, perceptions, and attitudes that have become subconscious automatic programs, just like a computer program. 95%. So then, would you agree then, if you have a self-depreciating thought, that in a matter of seconds you're going to feel unworthy? The moment you feel unworthy, aren't you going to think more unworthy thoughts? which are going to make more chemicals for you to feel unworthy. Then you're going to think more unworthy thoughts. And this cycle of thinking and feeling over time creates that state of being. And then you say, I am unworthy. And whenever you say, I am anything, you're commanding your mind and body as one. Now, if you keep doing this over and over again, and the body becomes the mind, the servant has become the master. The body is the servant to the mind. But once the body becomes the mind, the servant is now the master. So how many people here, at some point in your life, well, you have to be over 35 for this. We're looking good here. Couldn't consciously remember a phone number. You couldn't consciously remember a phone number, remember? Then you walked over to the receiver, you picked up the phone, you looked at the receiver, and you dialed the number. How did you do that? You couldn't consciously remember it, but your body did it so many times that it knew better than your brain. The body became the mind. Now, 95% of who you are is a set of those memorized behaviors. So think about this. Memorizing a state of being becomes 95% of who you are, and now people are going to try to change and use 5% of their conscious mind to work against 95% of what they've memorized. So they think positively, but guess what? They're feeling pretty negatively. They set up their dream board, and they got the SUV and the hairstyle and the nails and the dog and the kid in the baby seat in the back with his hair combed and totally happy. They got this whole vision of what their future is, but they feel unworthy. It's mind and body in opposition. They pray for a new life with their 5% of their conscious mind, but they feel guilty. It's mind and body in opposition. We have to recondition the body to a new mind. So then, if feelings become the means of thinking, and you can't think greater than how you feel, and you've conditioned your body to be the mind, then to change is to be greater than your body. Now this is what people don't like, because the moment you break that chemical continuity of how you've been thinking and feeling that feels so familiar to you, all of a sudden the body is no longer getting its chemical hit. It's not getting its reaffirmation of its identity. And the moment there's discord or discontinuity, the person begins to feel uncomfortable. They don't like that. Because to change is to step out from the familiar state of being into the unknown. And when you step out into the unknown, you can't predict the feeling of anything any longer. So people rush back to the same life. Now, feelings and emotions are the end product of past experiences. And you can remember experiences better because you can remember how they feel. And when you're in the midst of an experience, everything you're seeing and smelling and tasting and feeling and hearing, all of your 5 senses plug you into the environment. And as you're picking up all this vital sensory data from your environment, all of that information is rushing back to your brain through 5 different sensory pathways. And the moment it reaches your brain, jungles of neurons begin to organize themselves into patterns. And the moment those neurons string into place, the brain releases a chemical, and that chemical is called a feeling. So you can remember graduating from high school, you can remember the birth of one of your children, you can remember being proposed to, you could remember getting lost somewhere in Chicago, you can remember catching a fish off the coast of Mexico with your 4 best friends, going home and cooking it, and drinking that really good Cabernet Blanc as you watch the sun set and the ocean breeze hitting you in the face and you could smell the salt air. And we could say that when you had that experience, you felt altered inside of you. You felt different. And the moment you felt different inside of you, you paid attention to whoever or whatever caused it. And that event in and of itself is called a memory. As a matter of fact, you can tell me where you were on 9/11, who you were with, the time of day it was, and what you were doing, because you were disrupted in your typical chemical continuity. And the moment you felt altered because of everything you were seeing and hearing, you perked up for a moment and you paid attention to what caused it. So if you can remember that experience of catching the fish off the coast of Mexico with your friends and cooking it for dinner, how come you can't remember what you had for dinner the night before? Because routine lulls the brain to sleep. We go unconscious. Now, think about this. You're geniuses, right? So then, if you're in a cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking the same way, and you feel the same as the day before, and feelings and emotions are the end product of experiences, if you're feeling the same way as the day before, wouldn't you agree nothing new is happening in your life? Yes? Because you would feel differently. And now think about this. If feelings and emotions are end products or the end effect of an experience from the past, and those feelings are driving your thoughts, and you can't think greater than how you feel, are you thinking in the future or are you thinking in the past? And as long as you're thinking in the past, you as the quantum creator of reality, what are you creating more of? Quantum law still applies then. Now, your body is your unconscious mind. And it does not know the difference between an experience that you create in your life that produces an emotion and an emotion you fabricate by memory or thought alone. So think about this. You're still geniuses, right? So if you're thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking in the same cycle, and you're living by that same chemical continuity, your body is believing it's in the same past experience 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Your body's living in the past, and you can't create a new future living by the emotions of the past. Now, think about this. We all have had events in our life that are traumatic, and those events brand us emotionally. But when you have a reaction to something in your life, be it good or bad, there's a chemical refractory period that's created from your reaction. And when you don't know how to control your emotional reaction, and you allow that refractory period to run for, say, hours or days, you know what that's called? That's called a mood. What's wrong with you? I'm in a mood. Why are you in a mood? Well, this thing happened to me 4 days ago, and I'm memorizing my emotional reaction. And if you keep that same refractory period running for weeks or months, that's called a temperament. Why is he so angry? Why does he have such an angry temperament? I don't know. Why are you so angry? Well, this thing happened to me 8 months ago. And I'm living by the same emotions that keep me connected to the past. And if you keep that same refractory period going on for years on end, that's called a personality trait. And so how many people's personalities have become layers of emotions that keep them connected to the past that has nothing to do with who they really are? And we begin to wear these emotions layer by layer. And we begin to believe that we are something other than this conscious being using a brain and body to create reality. We become anchored to the past. And then all you have to do is to pay attention to how you feel. And then you're going to create this embellished story of why you are the way you are, right? Oh, this thing happened to me 10 years ago, and it was so traumatic. And then we start adding to the story, and as you begin to tell the story, you're firing and wiring those circuits in your brain to reinforce the identity. And if you work yourself up into some emotional froth, your body is being signaled emotionally into reconditioning it to the past. And when we move into a state of thinking and feeling now, we are in a state of being. And a state of being is a personality. And a personality creates a personal reality. So I never said that emotions were bad. Emotions are the end product of experiences. And what most human beings do is that they don't know how to shorten the refractory period of those emotions. And those emotions then define them. As an example, as you begin to shorten your emotional reaction to things, that's called emotional intelligence. And as long as you can control the amplitude of how you react, you know what I mean? Those people who have a very high amplitude, you know those chemicals of stress, for example? Do you know they only last 90 seconds to 2 minutes in your bloodstream? Anything past that, I tell my kids, you're faking it. because you're keeping that emotion going. Now, grieving and all of that, that's healthy to go through separation, because as some person or some experience has happened to you and you're moving beyond it, there's literally a dying of the old self, because your association neurologically connected to that person or that experience has to be pruned away. And that's the dying of the old, and it takes time for that healing to take place. So it's not about emotions being bad, it's just how long that emotional reaction lasts. So now, think about this. Your body is the unconscious mind. It doesn't know the difference between the actual experience that produces an emotion in your life, an emotion that you revisit in the past. Then if I said to you, a woman raising her family, married with 2 children, living the dream, and all of a sudden her husband comes home and he announces to her that he's moving to Buenos Aires with his 2 secretaries. And she has a real strong emotional reaction, and she feels hatred and bitterness and resentment and envy and jealousy. And what she doesn't know is that every time she reviews that past experience in her brain, remembers it, she's producing the same chemistry in her brain and body as if the event was happening. And the body, as the unconscious mind, is reliving the experience. And she does it over and over again, and it turns into a mood, and then it turns into a temperament, and it ultimately becomes part of her personality. And she does this for 20 years. And you approach her 20 years later and you say, "Why are you so bitter? Why are you so angry?" What do you think she's going to say? "I am this way because of this experience that happened to me," what? Which really translates into, well, I haven't changed in the last 20 years. I was altered from some experience, and I haven't been able to find myself after that experience. Another woman, raising her children with her husband, living the dream. All of a sudden, her husband comes home, and he announces that he's moving to Malaga, to the south of Spain, with his 2 secretaries and the mailman. Now, this woman goes through the same emotional reactions. She feels bitterness, she feels anger, she feels jealousy, envy. She's having the same emotional reactions. But at a certain point, all of a sudden, she says, "Gosh, living by this emotion really isn't loving to me. What piece of knowledge could I apply to this situation? How could I learn what love really is?" And so she reads a book or 2, she goes to some seminars, and she releases her ex-husband, forgives him and forgives herself, cuts the emotional bonds to him, and says unconditional love means freedom. I wish him the best. And she actually puts into practice everything she learned intellectually. She gets a job. She raises her children by herself, takes them to ballet and to soccer. She goes to school in the evenings, 3 nights a week, and gets her degree. 2 years later, she gets a new job in a new company, and she begins to progress and be promoted. All of a sudden, 3 years later, she falls in love with the senior vice president. They have a passionate relationship, and he travels for a living, and they buy a house in the south of France. And then her children graduate from college, and they get married, and they have grandchildren, and she has a home in Chicago and a home in the south of France. And you approach this woman 20 years later, and you say, "Yes, but your husband left you 20 years ago." What do you think she's going to say? "That was the best thing that ever happened to me." What's the difference? You see, we're defined by our adversity. We are literally defined by our adversity. And when you overcome an emotion that's connected to the past, a memory without the emotional charge is called wisdom, and that's the name of the game here. A memory without the emotional charge is called wisdom. And when we can transmute those emotions into wisdom, now we are free to create, and the soul now is liberated to move into a new future. You cannot move into a new future by living by that emotion. You could be the richest person, the most beautiful person, the most spiritual person, the most successful person, the most popular person. But if you haven't overcome that emotion, you haven't evolved at all in one lifetime. So then, This woman then, in the first scenario, all of a sudden has a moment of insight. And she realizes that she's been blaming and complaining and making excuses and feeling sorry for herself and talking about her past. And all of a sudden she begins to realize that she's reaffirming her identity by reviewing the past. And she says now, that's it. No more complaining, no more blaming, no more making excuses, no more feeling sorry for myself. I'm going to stop today. And all of a sudden the queen gets back on the throne. And what do you think the body's going to say after 20 years? Where you been? I've been doing this all by myself for the last 20 years. I've modified my receptor sites. I'm the servant. Now I can do this without you. All of a sudden you're going to come back? I don't think so. And now she's no longer thinking the same way. She's no longer acting the same way. And she's inhibiting those feelings. And the body goes into chaos. And it starts sending signals back to the brain. And right up the central nervous system. I call that the fast track. Right to the thinking brain. At the same time, chemical levels of suffering are dropping. And there's a thermostat in your brain called the hypothalamus. And it senses a lowering of suffering peptides. So all of a sudden, that limbic brain sends a signal to the thinking brain. That's called the slow track, to bring up the level of suffering chemicals, to remember how familiar it would be to be the same identity. And the next thing you know, this woman starts to hear this chatter in her head. You know that chatter. Why don't you start tomorrow? Tomorrow's a better day. There's too many reasons to suffer today. This doesn't feel right. You're too much like your mother. I hate my life. And then when we respond to those voices, that chatter, as if it's true, consciousness immerses itself back into the program, and we return back to thinking the same way, acting the same way, feeling the same way, but really expecting something to change in our life. Now, we have this amazing faculty as human beings. Because of the size of your frontal lobe, 40% of your entire brain, your frontal lobe is the crowning achievement of the human being. And your frontal lobe is what separates you from all other species on the planet. Your frontal lobe is the designer, it's the inventor, it's the architect. It restrains behaviors, it has attention, it has intention. It's the seat of your conscience. And when your frontal lobe begins to turn on, you can begin to think about what you're thinking about. You can become aware of how you're acting. You can notice how you're feeling. And because of that concept called metacognition or mindfulness, it means now that you can modify your behaviors to do a better job in life. And that's called neuroplasticity. And your brain literally reorganizes itself to reflect a new mind. That we're not hardwired to be the same way for the rest of our lives, or that we have the same genes and we're doomed by them. We're marvels of adaptability. So the new science gives us permission to change. So when most people begin to realize that change is going to be somewhat uncomfortable because they're going to step out of the known familiar self, they would rather stay in their suffering and happy to be unhappy. I was on a talk show just a little ways back, and as always happens, here comes the camera, and there's the lights flashing, and I know there's 20 seconds left. And all of a sudden this lady says to me, "So, can you tell us how to become happy?" I'm looking at the camera like 18 seconds, 17 seconds. And I said to her, "You want to become happy? You want to be happy? Stop being unhappy. Stop thinking the thoughts that make you unhappy. Stop choosing the same behaviors that undermine your greatness. Stop memorizing emotions that block the flow of joy into your life." So would you agree then that in order for you to move to a new future, you have to address what keeps you connected to the past? Yes? Now, most people don't like to do this because you got to light a match in a dark place. Everybody would rather just go ahead and try something else and try to change themselves from something outside of them. Reinvent a new identity by buying a new sports car, or, joining a new social club or, going on a vacation to a new place. They think that they can use their environment to reinvent themselves. But when the novelty of all of that wears off, you're left with the same feeling. And the midlife crisis is when all of a sudden people start looking at that feeling and they start realizing that nothing outside of them is making that feeling go away. And this is when they start to tell the truth and say, I don't love you. I don't even know what love is. What is God? What is life all about? Why am I doing all of this? And they start telling the truth because they start looking at that feeling that is the very foundation of who they are. That is the moment of greatness. That is the moment where we begin to really examine who we no longer want to be. Now, you have 3 brains. 3 brains in one that allow you to go from thinking to doing to being. Your thinking brain is your neocortex. It's that corrugated walnut on the outside with all those folds and valleys. It's the biggest part of the brain. It's the seat of your conscious awareness. You're listening to me right now with your thinking brain, your neocortex. And the neocortex loves to learn information. As a matter of fact, as you're listening to me right now, your brain is firing and wiring and reorganizing itself to create a new level of mind. And as you begin to make new connections in your brain and you begin to brand new circuits into place, that philosophical, theoretical, intellectual, analytical data is stored in your thinking brain. Now, when you take what you learn intellectually and you apply it, and you personalize it, or you demonstrate it, it means you're going to have to modify your behavior in some way and do something differently. And if you change your actions and you do something differently, would you agree, geniuses, that you're going to have a new experience? Yes. And the new experience creates a new emotion. So you read the book on how to dance the salsa. You read the book on how to cook Mandarin cuisine. You read the book on how to be a great parent, a patient parent. You read the book on success. You read the book on compassion. You read the book on forgiveness. And all of that information is stored in your thinking brain. And you're running around in your life and you're saying, hey, you know what your problem is? You need to forgive. And you over there, you need to be more compassionate. And you need to become more patient. People are knocking on your door at work, and they're asking for you to administer to them and resolve their problems. And you read the book 3 times, you saw the video, and it's all stored in your thinking brain. But all of a sudden now, you're getting ready to go to the company Christmas party. And then you got the Motown music playing and you're putting your makeup on, and all of a sudden you get the call from your best friend, and your arch enemy is at the Christmas party. You know, the one that betrayed you a year and a half ago and stabbed you in the back. And they say, she's at the party. And you throw down your makeup, and all of a sudden you think, I don't know how I'm going to get her, which chokehold I'm going to use to strangle her. And you start to think certain thoughts. And you begin to rehearse in your mind what you're going to do. And you start feeling all these emotions coming up. And the old personality is rearing its head that's connected to the past. And all of a sudden, you become conscious of that unconscious program. You begin to observe the way you're thinking. You begin to notice how you're feeling. You start to feel the drive and the propensity to behave in a certain way. And the moment you begin to observe that old state of mind and body, the moment you're observing it, it means you're no longer the program, but you're the consciousness observing the program. And that's when we begin to objectify our subjective self. And as you begin to pay attention to who you no longer want to be, nerve cells that no longer fire together no longer wire together. You begin to settle down the circuits in your brain that are connected to the old mind and the old self. And as you get yourself together and you walk into the living room, you stand there for a minute and you say, I read the book on forgiveness. Damn it. And then you think, what piece of knowledge did I learn in this book that I could apply to this situation to have a new experience? And then all of a sudden you're sitting there and you're going, okay, settle down. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to see myself in her. Blah. Okay, let me try. Oh, I'm supposed to stay present and not revisit the past. And you go down this laundry list of items of what you should do, and then very naturally, you do something so unique. You begin to rehearse a new way of being. And as you begin to contemplate how you're going to take all of this knowledge and apply it and personalize it and demonstrate it, you begin to cause your brain to fire in new sequences, in new patterns, and new combinations. And whenever you make the brain work differently, now you're changing your mind, because mind is the brain in action. And as you begin to fire and wire those new circuits in your brain, you're beginning to install the neurological hardware ahead of the actual experience, because now you have circuits in place to use when you get in that experience. Now your brain is primed for the experience. Now you walk into the Christmas party, and there's your enemy. And you do exactly what the book says. You get your behaviors to match your intentions. You get your actions equal to your thoughts. You restrain those impulses that are connected to the old mind, the old self. And you get your mind and body working together. And you walk up and you forgive. And the moment you do exactly what the book says, all of a sudden you have this new feeling from the experience. You feel compassion. You feel forgiveness. And the moment you have that feeling, you activate the limbic brain or the chemical brain. And now you are signaling your body with new information. You are teaching your body chemically to understand what your mind has intellectually understood. You see, knowledge is for the mind and experience is for the body. And we could say in that moment, you are embodying knowledge. The word is becoming flesh, and that new experience creates that new emotion. And you're literally signaling new genes in new ways, and now you are beginning to change the program. So you are chemically altering yourself from the new experience, and your body begins to get the message chemically. It's no longer philosophy, it's no longer theory. Now you're embodying the knowledge, and now you're beginning to change. But it's not enough to do it once. You can't forgive your enemy one time and expect to be on the stained glass windows at church. You have to be able to repeat the experience. You have to be able to do it over and over and over again. You have to be able to do it so many times that you neurochemically condition your body to memorize forgiveness or compassion as well as the conscious mind. And when your mind and body are working together, or your body knows as well as your mind, now you're in a state of being. And you activate that third brain, called the cerebellum, the seat of your subconscious mind. As a matter of fact, you've done it so many times, you don't even think about it any longer. You know how to do it, but you don't know how you know how. It's now innate in you. It's who you are. And when you memorize such an internal neurochemical order that no person, no thing, no experience can move you from it, now we call that mastery. Because in that state of being, there's a level of coherence inside of you that no incoherence in your external environment can move you from it. And when we're in that state of being now, mind and body are one. And now we are now a new personality. So then, a friend of mine is writing a book with the Dalai Lama. And he sat down with him a little ways back, and the Dalai Lama was telling him this story about how his very close friend, from the time he was an adolescent, was tortured by the Chinese. And when the Dalai Lama escaped in his late teens, he never said goodbye to his friend. And he thought about his friend all the time, and this friend was tortured every day for 45 years. And he was finally released from Tibet under Chinese rule, and the Dalai Lama was so excited to see him. And he said, he sat down with him and had tea, and he said, weren't you afraid when Chinese were torturing you? And the monk said, yes, one time I was afraid I didn't have compassion for the Chinese. Memorizing an internal neurochemical order that no person, no thing, no experience can move you from it. That is when we begin to master who we are. So, how many people here know someone who's mastered suffering? Doesn't have to be you. Could be anybody. And you say to them, hey, did you read the book I gave you? No. You see that DVD of that? No. Hey, listen, we're going to go out to dinner. We're going to go see some stand-up comedy. You want to come? No. What are they saying? I'm insisting on this neurochemical order that no person, no thing, no experience can move me from it. These altruistic states, we have these three brains to evolve who we're being. And it seems like the quantum field responds to who you're being. Not what you're thinking, not what you're feeling, but who you're being. And there was an experiment done in California a little ways back where they took a group of people that were expert prayers. Now, prayer is a skill, just like golf or tennis. The more you practice it, the better you get at it. And they held these 3 vials of DNA out in front of these subjects. And they said to these people, with all of your intention, now all intention is, let's demystify it, intention is getting clear on what you want. That's it. With all of your intention, this is a thought process, intention is a thought process, we want you to see this DNA winding or unwinding in your mind with all of your intention. Get clear on this DNA winding, unwinding. And they practiced this over and over again, over and over again. At the end of the experiment, they checked the DNA, and guess what happened? Nothing. Intention did absolutely nothing to change the DNA. So then they said to these people, okay, now, we want you to move into an elevated mood. We want you to feel goodwill, loving kindness, gratitude. And we want you to radiate this feeling out into the quantum field, and let's see if it does anything to the DNA. So they practiced it over and over again in these vials. When they checked the vials to see if the DNA was altered or denatured in any way, guess what happened? Nothing. Elevated emotions did absolutely nothing to change the DNA. But when they said to these people, we want you to get very clear in your mind on this DNA unwinding, and then we want you to give thanks or get in touch with how you would feel if the DNA unwound ahead of the actual event. Did you hear me? Guess what happened? 25% of the DNA unwound. You see, the thoughts that we think are like the electrical charge in the quantum field. And the feelings that we emote tend to be the magnetic charge in the quantum field. And how you think and how you feel broadcasts an electromagnetic signature, biophotons that influence every single atom in your life. The thought sends a signal out, and the feeling draws the event back. So it begs the question then, what are you broadcasting on a daily basis? Now, what if you woke up in the morning, instead of getting out of bed, doing the same things, seeing the same people, going to the same places that create the same experiences, that produce the same emotions, you woke up and before you got out of bed, you said, what is the greatest ideal of myself that I can be today? And you eliminated the cues from the external environment, so the environment was no longer regulating how you think and feel. And you decreased the amount of sensory information coming into your brain, and you said, let me become conscious of my unconscious thoughts. Let me begin to become familiar with them so that they would never slip by my awareness again. Let me begin to observe my behaviors that keep me returning back to the same identity that creates the same experiences. And what emotions have I memorized that keep me returning back to a lower denominator? And I want to become so conscious of these unconscious programs, like Gandalf on the bridge, you may not pass today. And you make a decision with such firm intention that the amplitude of the decision begins to rewrite the program, and the decision becomes an experience, and the experience carries a very strong emotional quotient, and your body begins to respond. And then you say, how would greatness be today? What is love? Can I demonstrate it? What would greatness do in this situation? And as you begin to think about and contemplate a new way of being. You're making your brain work in new patterns and sequences. And as you remind yourself who you no longer want to be, and you begin to remind yourself who you do want to be, if by chance the thoughts that you're thinking, and the privilege of being a human being is that we can make thought more real than anything else, the thought in your mind becomes the experience. What's the end product of an experience? An emotion. You begin to feel like that new ideal. Your body is literally getting the information emotionally ahead of the actual experience. And now you are moving into a new state of being. And if you're in a new state of being, then you're broadcasting a whole new electromagnetic field. And if you can get up differently than when you started, then we could say then, if you could maintain that modified state of mind and body your entire day, get ready, because something different is going to happen in your world. That's the law. And it will come in a way that you least expect, that surprises you, that leaves no doubt that what you did inside of you produced some result outside of you. Now, the word meditation, I love to demystify the mystical, and I think science is the contemporary language of mysticism right now, because when we use science to describe these concepts, nobody's excluded. If you talk about religion or culture or tradition, you start segregating everybody, but science tends to be the language of mysticism. So the biological model of change actually works exactly according to the laws of the old scriptures in terms of meditation. The word meditation literally means, in Tibetan, that symbol means to become familiar with. So if you begin to become familiar with the unconscious thoughts, behaviors, and emotions until they're so familiar to you because you've observed that state of mind and body, would you agree then, if you closed your eyes and began to become familiar with your old self, that you would be meditating? Absolutely. To know thyself. And as you begin to become familiar with a new state of being, and you can remind yourself every day at who you do want to be, would you agree then that in time, if you practiced it neurologically and chemically, it would begin to become familiar to you? Would you agree? The word meditation in Sanskrit means to cultivate self, to literally cultivate self. So mystics that came out of the Himalayas and they walked through the fertile valleys and healing all these people, and the people said, how did you perform these miracles? And what do you think they said in the language that the farmers could understand? You have to cultivate up the old self and cultivate a new self. Now, how many people here have ever planted a garden? So, would you agree then, if you left the plants from the past in the garden and you didn't pull out those weeds that went unnoticed, that were like thoughts that were slipping by your awareness, and you didn't remove those rocks that sifted to the top that represent your emotional blocks, and the litter that blew in, and never cultivated or broke down the soil and fertilized it, what if you cast seeds on that garden? Very little fruit, would you agree? But what if you pulled out the weeds of the past and began to pull out the rocks that block the emotional, that represent your emotional blocks? Soften the soil, and you planted a garden then. So the process of change is exactly the same way. Process of change requires unlearning and relearning. It requires breaking the habit of the old self and reinventing a new self. It's what we call in neuroscience pruning synaptic connections and sprouting new connections. Unmemorizing emotions that have been stored in the body, then reconditioning the body to a new mind or to a new emotion. To literally go from an energy of the past to the energy of the future. So, in the workshops that we've been teaching pretty much for the last 3 years, is it possible then that people, when they move into a new personality, that they have physical and health-related changes that could take place in their body? Because they're no longer signaling the same gene in the same way. So if you are reacting to the same circumstances in your life, the reaction to those circumstances keep creating the same emotions. And those emotions then keep signaling the same gene. And it is a scientific fact that the chemicals of stress, those strong, violent emotions, begin to push the genetic buttons that create disease. Now, we live in two states of mind. We either live in survival or we live in creation. Now, living in survival is living in stress. And stress is when your body's knocked out of homeostasis. Stress is when your body's knocked out of balance. The stress response is what your body naturally does to return itself back to order. And we have three types of stresses. You have physical stress, like accidents, injuries, traumas. You have chemical stress, like flus and allergies and low blood sugar and pesticides and pollutants and heavy metals, toxins. And then you have emotional stress, traffic jams, internet connections, second mortgages, single parenting, 401ks. All of those things knock your brain and body out of balance. Now, so if a gazelle is grazing in the Serengeti and the lioness begins to chase the gazelle, if the gazelle outruns the lion, 15 minutes later the gazelle goes back to grazing. Short-term stress returns back to balance, and every organism in nature is designed for short-term stress, emergency situations. So when the gazelle sees the lion, she turns on a very primitive nervous system called the fight-or-flight nervous system or the sympathetic nervous system to mobilize all this energy to prepare itself for this threat. Human beings, do you know that we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone? We can begin to think about some worst-case scenario. We can begin to forecast some future event based on the past memory, and we can focus on it to the exclusion of everything else to such a degree that the body begins to believe it's in that future event now. And the body gets knocked out of balance just by thought alone. We can unfold a past bitter memory that's tattooed in the recesses of our gray matter. And like magic, it comes to life, and in that moment it's real, and the body, as the unconscious mind, is beginning to experience that past event, and it doesn't know the difference. Now, when we turn on the stress response and we can't turn it off, now we're headed for disease. Because no organism can tolerate the emergency situation constantly. Now, here's the problem. Those chemicals of stress, that adrenaline that's being released and cortisol that's being released into the body, gives the body and brain a jolt of energy. And we begin to unconsciously or subconsciously associate that rush of energy with some addiction to reaffirm who we think we are as a somebody. So we keep the problems in our life and the conditions in our life and the bad relationship or the bad job just so that we can remember who we are based on that addiction. And when we get that rush of energy like the triple cappuccino, that rush of chemistry creates the emotions of aggression, of anger, of hatred, of prejudice, of resentment, of insecurity, of anxiety, of fear, of sadness, hopelessness, powerlessness. This is what the psychological model calls normal states of consciousness. These are the altered states of consciousness. And those chemicals endorse the ego for it to become very selfish, very self-involved, very self-centered, very self-indulgent. It's all about the self. And when the gazelle is being chased by the lioness, she's only concerned about three things during that sympathetic response. You know what they are? Her body, the environment, and time. She says, I got to take care of this body. Where in my environment am I going to go? And how much time do I have to get there? Now, when you and I live by the hormones of stress, we obsess about our bodies. We obsess about things in our environment, and we obsess about time. We become materialists. And as we begin to focus on the body, the environment, and time, we begin to believe that we are a body in this environment living in linear time, and that's not who we are. Now, the atom is 99.999 with 13 zeros after it, percent nothing. It's energy. They feel real, don't they? They're more nothing than something. They're 0.0 with 12 zeros and a 1 at the end, particle, matter. And when we live by the hormones of stress, living by those lower frequency chemicals, we pay attention to the particle and we eliminate all the possibility. We define reality with our senses and we become materialists, believing that we're a body in the environment and time. Now, that's not who we are. Because did you ever notice when you're in that elegant state of creation, The one thing that happens when you're in a creative state is you forget about yourself. You become nobody, no thing, no time. You literally abandon your identity. And when that happens, there is a biological shift that happens in your brain. When you're running by the hormones of stress, the hindbrain is controlling the forebrain. But when you're in a creative state, the frontal lobe and the forebrain begins to control the hindbrain. And like a great symphony leader, the frontal lobe, when it begins to speculate and invent new possibilities, it doesn't want to be distracted by anything else. So the frontal lobe acts like a volume control, and it lowers the volume of the circuits in your brain that have to do with time and space. And in that moment where the thought that you're thinking literally becomes the experience, and you forget about yourself, that's the moment you walk through the door to the quantum field. You see, you can't enter the quantum field as a somebody. You have to enter as a nobody. And when we live by the hormones of stress, not that any of us have ever experienced this, we feel separate from possibility, and we are trying to force the outcome. But when you're living in that creative state and you put all your awareness from the particle to possibility, and how many potentials exist in the quantum field? And your brain literally, because of the frontal lobe, can begin to gather circuits that are connected to knowledge that you've learned and experiences that you have, and seamlessly piece together a new design. And as you begin to go within and you picture that design, as the brain begins to fire in tandem with new circuits, you have a new idea. And as you begin to focus on that idea, the thought that you're thinking literally becomes the experience, and you abandon your body. You become nobody. You abandon your association, your identity to things in your environment. You forget about time. You become pure consciousness. And the moment you do that, you feel connected to something greater. And you would never try to force the outcome. You trust in the outcome because you already experienced it. You're beyond your senses. The quantum physics is nonsense. It's beyond the senses. And when we move into the state, you have to begin to realize that in order for us to change something about our body, like health, or to change something in our environment, our life, or to alter some line of time, we have to forget about our body. We have to forget about everything in our environment. We have to forget about time. We have to leave the old world behind. Now, most people wait for crisis or trauma or disease or diagnosis or loss to get about the business of change. You know what I mean, right? We have to reach that lowest level where we finally say, I don't want to do this any longer. You begin to look at who you are, and you begin to take a close look at what you need to change. My message is, why wait? You can learn and change in a state of pain and suffering, or you can learn and change in a state of joy or inspiration. Now, if the chemicals of stress dysregulate and downregulate genes to create disease, and you can turn on the stress response just by thought alone, then by very nature, our thoughts can make us sick. Would you agree? And if our thoughts can make us sick, is it possible then that our thoughts can make us well? Yes? So we had this man in one of our workshops stand up and, he was on an elevator, and he was getting ready to go to his work, and as he was standing on the elevator, there was a dermatologist standing right next to him, and the dermatologist looked over at his face, and he said, "Oh my gosh, step off the elevator with me." And so the man got off the elevator, and he said, "That's malignant melanoma on your face." He said, "Walk down the hallway with me, you're coming to my office." And so he went to the doctor's office, he showed up a week later, and they froze the melanoma, they surgically removed it, and then they radiated it. 4 months later, the melanoma grows back on his neck, a little bit larger. He goes back, he has the same exact procedure, they freeze it, they cut it out, they radiate it. 4 months later, it shows up on his side even bigger. So he goes back, they freeze it, they cut it out, they radiate it. 3 months later, it grows back on his calf about the size of an apricot. Now, this guy had seen What the Bleep, and he read my book, he read a couple other books, he had come to our level 1 workshops, and he said, "Now what marble is rolling around in my brain. This is his exact words, that keeps creating this condition. So guess what he does? He packs up his bags and he takes his wife to Mexico. He retreats from his familiar environment that reaffirms his identity every day. And as he sits on the beach in Mexico, he says, what emotion have I memorized that keeps signaling the same gene in the same way that keeps my body connected to the past? Now, he was so busy being this emotion that he didn't even realize that he was it. And all of a sudden, he became conscious of the fact that he resented everyone and everything every day of his life. But it was so familiar to him, he didn't even know he was doing it. Not that any of us would do that. And so he sits down under this palapa. He takes out a piece of paper and he asks himself a brilliant thought. Now, when I'm feeling resentment, how do I think? What are the thoughts that are driven by that emotion? And he sits down and he begins to observe himself in his life, his old self, and he begins to write down every one of the thoughts. Now, if he's observing himself, it means he's no longer the programmer, he's the consciousness observing the program, and he's beginning to objectify his subjective self. He's beginning to awaken. He's becoming conscious. And he writes down every one of those thoughts. And he sits on the beach and he says, I'm going to remember every one of these thoughts because these are old circuits that I've fired and wired in my brain that are connected to the old self, and they will never slip by my awareness again. Next day, he reviews those thoughts again, but the second question he asks himself is, how do I behave? What do I say? How do I act? What habits have I created that are driven by this emotion of resentment? And he sits down and he writes down all the actions and behaviors. And he memorizes that list. Comes back the next day, he reviews the first two, the thoughts and behaviors, and then he says, what emotions are driven by this emotion of resentment? Oh, I'm judgmental, I'm impatient. He begins to look at the old self. And he makes a decision with firm intention that he no longer wants to be this person. And the decision is greater than the addiction that's connected to the emotion of the old self, with a greater amplitude. Like Gandalf on the bridge. You can't pass any longer. And as he begins to do this every day, 5 days in a row, after 5 days, now remember, he's inhibiting the circuits from firing in the same patterns. He's no longer behaving in the same way. The body's not getting the same neurochemical information. He's no longer signaling the same gene. And all of a sudden, after 5 days, guess what happens? He starts getting happy. Because the body is no longer anchored to the past and believing it's living in the same past experience as the unconscious mind 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The body is freed from the chains of that addiction. And whenever the body is freed from any addiction, the side effect is called joy. The particle becomes more wave. And now he has available energy to create with, because now he's beginning to liberate those emotions in terms of energy. And now that he's starting to feel good, what is his natural thought? He starts to think about who he's going to be when he returns back into his life. Starts planning his behaviors. And neuroscience says that you can change your brain just by thinking. That the brain doesn't know the difference between an actual experience that produces an event or the experience that you fabricate from mind alone. So as he begins to think about what energy he wants to put behind new thoughts, what behaviors he wants to demonstrate, as he begins to mentally rehearse a new way of being, he's beginning to fire and wire new circuits in his brain, and he's beginning to sprout new neurons that have become the very platform of his new identity. And as he begins to plan how he's going to act, he starts to feel the emotions ahead of the actual experience. And his body, as the unconscious mind, is living that future event in the present moment, and he's signaling new genes in new ways. Does this for 5 days. At the end of 5 days, he packs up his bags with his wife, and he goes back to Denver. And on the day of his surgery, he's in the shower washing his hair, and he looks down, and the tumor fell off his leg. So he picks the tumor up, and he puts it in a plastic bag, and he calls the doctor, and he says, what do I do with this thing? And they say, bring it in, we want to see it. Now, new personality, new personal reality. The disease existed in the old personality, but not in the new personality. Because the resentment was connected to the gene that was continuously being signaled, and when he became somebody else, he became a new personality, and he began to rewrite the program of who he was, and disease could no longer exist in the new self. He didn't have to visualize little Pac-Men going in there and eating the cancer. He just became another personality. Now, you want to know the hardest part of all of this? You ready? There's the hardest part of all of it, making the time to do it. That's it. Taking time for our precious selves to begin to look at how we would like to be a work in progress and reinvent a new identity. Keep what we have that's worth it, and then add to who we want to be. So if we live by the laws of Newtonian physics of cause and effect, something outside of us changes how we feel inside of us, we react to that thing outside of us in our environment, and then we begin to respond to it emotionally. That's cause and effect. That's the old model of reality. The quantum model of reality says we're going to change how we think and feel inside of us, and then we are going to measure the effects outside of us. That's called causing an effect. And the result of causing an effect produces what I call empowerment. And when you feel empowered by who you're being, then the natural thing happens is instead of living by the selfish model of stress, we begin to live by the selfless model. We begin to consider the whole when we make a choice. Now that is the beauty behind evolution, that the old model of living as an ego, pushing our way to the front, is driven by those primitive emotions. And those elevated emotions have something else that really is the natural state of being. So my children have all grown up with these concepts and these ideas. And from the time they were very little, I set up conditions for them to begin to help them realize how their thoughts have a major imprint on their future. Now, my daughter is the greatest creator I have ever seen in my life. And my children all work on something that they are interacting with in the quantum field, and I have absolutely no intervention in the process. They have to create it on their own. So my daughter's 22 now. She's created unlimited shopping sprees. She's created $7,500 in the shopping spree. Came to her in a way that she least expected. She did it. She started a music video. We get clear on the intention, and she moves into that reality. So she called a little over a year ago, and she said, "Hey, Dad, listen." She was in college. She said it was May. She says, "I want to work this summer." I thought, this should be good. This is new. And she said, "But listen, I don't want to work, hostessing, and I don't want to wait tables, and I don't want to work in your office or any of that stuff. I want to have a job." Now, here's intention, where I travel to Europe. I want to be in at least 6 different cities in Italy. I want to go for half the summer, then I want to be home on the ranch with you. I want to learn something new. I want to do something really fun. I want to be back home by the end of July. What else did she say? Oh, and I want to have a week in Florence before I head home. Now, what am I going to say to her? No? I can't say no to her because she's created too many amazing things. As a matter of fact, sometimes I say to her, "Yeah, how are you going to do that?" And she says, "Dad, you taught me this stuff." I'm like, "Oh, okay, sorry." So I said, "Okay, here's the deal. You have to get very clear in your mind on what your future is. And every day I want you to rehearse that you just had the most amazing summer of your life in Italy. But here's the deal. You cannot get up as the same person who sat down. Because if you get up as the same person who sat down, nothing's happened in the quantum field, nothing's happened neurologically or chemically or epigenetically. You're still the same person. You got to get up like you have just had the most amazing summer of your life." What do you think she says? "No problem, Dad." Now, my daughter does not wait for the experience to drive the emotions. She knows how to get in touch with the emotion ahead of the actual experience. That's the quantum model. Giving thanks before the event happened, what is the emotional signature of gratitude? When do you usually give thanks? After. The quantum model says you got to give thanks before, and you have to convince your body emotionally that the event is already done. Then you can just get up and live as if your prayers are already answered. So my daughter knows how to do this. So she's rehearsing every day, and she calls me up, 2 weeks after, and she says, "Dad, listen, there's this opportunity in the university. I can go to Italy. It's going to cost $7,000, but don't panic. I could use my wild card credits. I can get it down to $4,000. I have to buy my ticket to Rome. And she's going through this whole thing, and her name's Jana. We call her Gigi. I said, Gigi, that's not it. You're trying to force the outcome. The experience has to find you. I said, you got to go back in there with more passion now. I want you to live it. And I want your body, every time you finish your meditation, your body believes it's already done. So she practices for another couple of weeks. Now, every time we get an email to our website, and by the way, the greatest compliment that we ever get is when people actually put this into practice. You know, getting people to go from thinking to doing is like herding cats. You know, everybody wants to stay in that intellectual realm. But the people who actually do it, you know what the first line says on the email? No. It says, same one every time. You're not going to believe this. That's it, every time. So my daughter calls up, you know, I can't tell if she's happy or sad or she's crying on the phone. You're not going to believe this, you know. So I call her back. I said, what? She said, oh, my God, it happened today. I'm like, okay. Tell me everything. Don't you leave anything out. She says, okay, I'm in the university. I'm in the library, and I'm making copies of some art from the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And she had a semester in Florence, and so she's making these copies, and here comes the art history teacher, and they start talking. And the art history teacher starts asking her about Florence, and my daughter says, I spent a lot of time at the Uffizi Gallery, and then all of a sudden they start talking Italian, because my daughter's fluent. And the art history teacher stops and says, oh my God, come with me. And so she grabs my daughter and she waltzes her across the campus to the chair of the language department, who happens to be the Italian teacher. And he says, listen, I'm taking a group of American students to Italy. I need someone to teach level 1 Italian to these beginning students in Italy. We're traveling to 6 cities in Italy. We will finish on July 26th. We will pay for all of your travel. We will pay you for your time. You will be my personal assistant. I will train you how to do this. And we're going to finish in Florence, and you'll have a week in Florence. I said to my daughter, that's more like it. Now, she didn't try to control the outcome. When we're living by those hormones of stress and the ego is very selfish, we are trying to force the outcome. We're trying to make it happen. When you have made contact and you go from particle to wave and you're focusing on possibility instead of matter, when you do that, you shift your awareness as the quantum observer, and you do that in an elegant way, and you feel connected to something greater, you would never try to control the outcome. You're already trusting that it happened. Now, I say to my daughter, a little ways back, because I always am interested in this, I say, how do you do it? How do you do it? She says, Dad, you know what? Every day I just move into a different state of being in my meditations. And I get up like it's already done, and then I live as if my prayers are already answered. And the moment I start analyzing where it's going to come from and when, I just return back to the same self. The new self would never think that way. I said, say that again? Now, do you know that there's been amazing research on the physiology of tickling? Do you know that you cannot be tickled if you know where you're going to be tickled and when? Now, the universe wants to tickle you. It wants to surprise you. And the elevated emotion that's created from the experience is always way greater than you imagined. Now, that kind of lifted emotion, then, from the experience does something very unique. It drives you to create the next experience, which creates the next experience, and we move out of this limited state into a more unlimited state. Now, there is an intelligence within you that's giving you life. It's keeping your heart beating right now, over 2 gallons of blood per minute, over 100 gallons of blood in 1 hour, through 60,000 miles of blood vessels, 100,000 times in one day, and your vascular system is 3% of your body weight. You lose 25 million cells every second. Oh, you just made another 25 million. You keeping track of that? That in one cell of your body, it goes through the order of 100,000 chemical reactions per second. Now multiply that by the 70 trillion or 100 trillion cells that make up your body. Are you keeping track of that? Or would you say that there's some consciousness, some mind that's giving us life? Now that same intelligence that's giving you life is the same intelligence that's creating supernovas in distant galaxies, that's forcing a lily into bloom, that's creating the light off the salmon's scales. And when your will matches its will, when your mind matches its mind, when your love for life matches its love for you, it always answers the call. And that when we begin to develop a relationship with this intelligence, can't see it, can't smell it, can't taste it, can't feel it, but it's alive. And it's both personal and universal. It's within us and all around us. And if you emulate this intelligence as a creator and you say, okay, I took time out of my busy day to emulate you as a creator, but I'm kind of tired of this kind of one-way communication. I need evidence to know that you've been paying attention to my efforts. So I need a sign to let me know that you're real. And as you begin to enact your divine ability to create, and the universe begins to organize events in your life in a way that's right for you, wouldn't you agree then that the more you did this, the more belief and acceptance you would have in your own personal evolution? Yes? So what is our purpose in life? Purpose in life isn't to be beautiful or rich or popular or to please God. Our purpose in life is to begin to express this intelligence through us. And as we begin to remove these layers and masks that block the flow of this intelligence, the emotions that we memorize, the habits that stand in the way of this divine intelligence, as layer by layer we begin to remove it, this intelligence begins to leak out of us, begins to move through us, and we become more like it. We become more loving. That's its mind. That's what it is. It's a loving intelligence. We become more conscious. That's what it does. It's a consciousness. We become more willful. We become more giving. It's a giver of life. Its mind becomes our mind. Its nature becomes our nature. And as we begin to express this intelligence through us, we begin to act like this intelligence in every area of our life, which means we are now living in a selfless state. And when you and I free ourselves from the chains of these programs, the side effect of it, that liberation of energy, is what I call the natural state of being. And when you overcome some aspect of yourself in your life, because you took the time to do it, and you truly break through, there's only one thing you want to do when you're in that state. You want to give. You say, I feel so great. Here, have this. I want you to feel like I feel. And when we reach this point, of course, in our own level of growth, then of course, it's time to celebrate our life.